Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Champions Path, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using the code Omnipoke. For today's video, it's finally time for the Vivid Voltage set review. Myself and Jack are going to be going over these cards together, talking about the best and most interesting cards from the set that's coming out in less than a month now. A lot of people have already mentioned this set isn't as competitive as some of the other Sword and Shield sets that we've been blessed with over the last few months, but we're still going to give you our honest opinions on these as we go through, and of course we're bringing back the rating system.
Yes, and as usual, you can pause here for the ratings, as well as Joe just flashed on the screen, there's the community ratings are back as well. We had over 280 responses this time, which is huge. Each set review we seem to get more and more responses, which is really, really good. It's great that we're able to get your opinions on the cards as well, because it's always a really, really good and interesting comparison point, and it sort of helps us give us a bit of an idea of what you guys think of the cards as well. But without further ado, let's kick straight off with the trainers. As always, we have Alistair here. Alistair is a new supporter card. You draw 3 cards and then discard up to 3 cards from your hand. You must discard at least 1. So new draw supporters are always good. We like to see draw supporters. Unfortunately, naturally, when a new draw supporter comes into the format, you have to immediately compare it to things like Marnie and Research, because those two are so powerful. And in general, a lot of the draw supporters that come into or come out are naturally a bit weaker, but just because of how powerful those two are. But Alistair is actually pretty interesting. The discard synergy is definitely worth noting, and there are a variety of different decks that always want to get specific things in the discard pile. Things like the Mad Party deck getting the more Mad Party Pokemon in the discard, as well as Mewtwo decks getting some attackers in there. Kind of comparable to Hapo and things like Sinlin. Sinlin can only discards 1 but draws 3, so it's specifically, well, pretty much identical to Alistair, but you also get a supporter back, so maybe a little bit underwhelming in that respect, but you do have to discard first, whereas Alistair, you're allowed to draw some Mad Parties and then discard them, which is great. Hapo is a bit more risk versus reward. You discard the top 6 and look at 2, so there's lots of different discard synergies we have in format right now. Only Sinlin is really seeing play in certain applications, and that's mainly for the fact that you can get a supporter back with it. So I think in general we're not going to see too much from Alistair, but this is actually a fairly good draw supporter, and if it weren't for things like Marnie and Research, I think this would be a really, really solid one for decks like Poltegeist and Mad Party and Mewtwo. And it may still seem very, very niche play in some of these types of kind of archetypes. So it's a good draw supporter, but for most decks it's just going to be outclassed by things like Research and Marnie.
Yeah, I think that's been the case since the release of Sword and Shield. Those cards are just so insane that every other supporter is going to have a hard time making headway. This one does have some specific help, but like you say, I could see it being like a 10th supporter in a deck here and there once you've covered your bases with the others. Next up we have B, and this is some fighting type energy acceleration support, something that really is lacking in the fighting type category. It says discard the top 5 cards of your deck and attach all energy you discarded this way to your benched fighting Pokemon in any way that you like. Now, B does just state all energy that you discarded, so it can be a way of getting all sorts of things into play, but let's have the most direct comparison, and that's End's Resolve. End's Resolve, we have an amazing Dragon-type Pokemon, probably the most playable Dragon-type you could have in the game right now in ADP, and it's not using this End's Resolve supporter effect, which is allowing you to see an additional card and could be insane acceleration. So when you're directly comparing it to one of the best attackers that's currently used in the game with a direct effect, basically interchangeable supporter, and that's seeing no play whatsoever, it really makes me concerned for the fact that our fighting type support only really is fitting niches here and there in the format right now. So it's hard for me to see B doing all that well. We do have some synergistic cards like Rotom Phone and Oranguru to guarantee possibly like 1 energy being attached. I do like this is flexible as well. End's Resolve is only to 1 target, whereas B is more flexible. So in those high roll situations, potentially you can get multiple things set up. But ultimately, 5 cards isn't like a huge dig. You don't have enough Pokemon draw a lot of the time to make this work for you. and there's only a handful of niche fighting types that can actually make the most out of this. So I'm not seeing Eternatus being as popular of a deck to really make fighting, stand alone in the format and be like a insta counter, and you don't have to worry about the rest of the metagame. That's just not how it's panned out so far. So these fighting decks are still going to struggle to compete with the other things currently in our format, and B doesn't really change too much in that regard.
Definitely. Next up, we have Beauty. Beauty is actually a really, really flashy supporter, as you may play the card even if you're going first, which is pretty interesting. But it's just a flat draw 2. And unfortunately, a flat draw 2, even when going first, just isn't worth the payoff. You can only run 4 of these in your deck, so naturally, you're not always going to see it. And it's only 2 cards. When we have things like Dedenne and Crobat already to just turbo through the deck on turn 1 regardless, you're already kind of paling in comparison because you're only 2 cards, along with certain decks playing Jirachi, as well as a lot of people forget Judge's Whistle is actually still in format, and that's a flat draw 1 card, but it's not your supporter for the turn. Yes, you can't use a supporter on turn 1, so it's strictly better than a Judge's Whistle on turn 1, but for the rest of the game, you'd much rather see a Judge's Whistle so that you can draw into Marnie or Boss or Research, anything like that. So whilst the flashy, you may play this card even if you're playing going first, text is on the card, it's actually pretty irrelevant because the effect is just not strong enough to even warrant playing 4 of this card, and that's even on the first turn of the game. When you're playing this on not the first turn of the game, it's even worse. It's worse than a How, it's worse than a Hop, and all of these cards have never ever seen play. So yeah, Beauty has a really, really cool line of text, but unfortunately it just doesn't outweigh what the card actually does.
Next up, we have Caralist. Now, this is actually a gym promo, so we're not guaranteed to have this in the set, but we thought we may as well cover the card anyway. That's why you're not seeing a community discussion on this, but ultimately, we don't think this is going to come to much. The card says, search your deck for up to 2 rare fossils and put them directly onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. We know that the rare fossils don't really have much going for them. I think Arctazol is the only one that saw any experimentation at all, and this supporter isn't going to be changing that fact. We've seen the unidentified fossils, how they've had a stadium card doing basically this effect, and it does end your turn, which is a bit awkward, but I still think using a supporter is probably more awkward than using that stadium outcome. So yeah, this card isn't going to push the fossils too much until possibly we get better versions of the new fossil Pokemon.
Next up, we have League Staff. League Staff is another draw supporter. Draw 2 cards if the Wyndham Stadium is in play. Draw 2 more cards, so very, very comparable to Coach Trainer. However, it is easier for Coach Trainer. It's easier for you to have a tag team Pokemon in the active than a specific stadium, and Coach Trainer isn't seeing play at all, given that even though one of the best decks or multiple of the best decks in the format are or have tag teams in them, Coach Trainer isn't seeing any play, and as such, League Staff is very unlikely to see any play. It's much easier to bounce a stadium anyway, so you can't rely on having this. If you put it in one turn, you're not going to guarantee to have it next turn, so you already maybe have to find an extra card in the first place. But also, whilst Chaotic Swell is in the format, you actually then have to play things like Marshadow or Dangerous Drill in Dark decks, things like that, to be able to get rid of Swell, to then put your Wyndham Stadium down to even draw 4 cards. So it's a very, very cute sort of combo between the decks, but in general, the combo just is actually a lot more complex than it needs to be for the payoff of 4 cards.
Next up, we have Leon, a slightly more interesting supporter from the ones we've seen so far. It says, this turn, your Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. I think we really have been needing some damage mod in the format since Professor Kukui left to rotation. Now, directly comparing it to Kukui, it's 10 more damage, which is nice, but it doesn't have any flexibility to the card at all. You're basically only doing this when it's pushing you over into one-shot range. Now, I think there are a couple archetypes that may look towards using Leon, but I think straight away, my biggest criticism of the card and why we're rating it lower than a lot of the community is that it only works on that one specific turn where it's pushing you over the edge math-wise. Now, obviously, there is a Charizard from this set. It's one of the pre-release cards, and it's also in the theme deck, so you'll have easy access to a Charizard Leon deck if you really want to. But we don't think that's going to be particularly high tier. That will certainly be playing Leons because you need to. But for the general formats, breakpoints of damage really don't come up too much just because of how far off things are from hitting 340, 320 all in one hit KO. I think it's only really Eternatus VMAX that I'm thinking for the current decks that we have in Standard that can look towards using Leon. And even in those moments where you're playing Scoop Up Net Zigzagoon and possibly playing things like Poker Gears, there's only going to be one or two situations in a game anyway where Leon could be the difference. There'll be times where you don't hit him on the right turns. There'll be times where your opponent has healed, their opponent, or even when you just haven't had enough Zigzagoon Scoop Up Nets in the first place to get you close enough for the Dread End to reach that sort of 300 sort of number with the help of Leon. So I think it's one of those cards that could see play in Eternatus, which gave us enough reason to give it the nod. And of course, we have Pokegear and Eldegoss in the format, so a situational card like this can be dug out at decent times for you to be a game changer, similar to how Boss is game. Now, Leon is that new card that could be game in certain situations, and that is impactful and does give it a lot of brownie points, but it's just the number of decks that I see it going in is actually quite limited for just the breakpoints of damage that we have in the format compared to the number of hit points that all of our things have currently, as we have so many VMAXs going on in the format right now.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, Leon is strictly deal 30 more damage. Kukui drew cards, so it had versatility in areas where you weren't just using it for the damage. And in comparison to another non-draw supporter like Boss, well, if you're not winning the game off of Boss, you can still Boss and try and stall something out. Whereas Leon is literally, you'll use it, it only has one purpose. Like you say, there's no depth or flexibility to the card. That doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it also makes it a lot worse in comparison to some of these other non-draw supporters like Kukui or Boss. So yeah, a really, really interesting card. And like you say, one that I think we will probably be appreciative of in the format at some point. But right now, we don't see too many situations where it's better than just digging for a boss, where you also get to have the other flexibility of doing things like stalling with Boss and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, an interesting card, and it will definitely see experimentation for sure. Probably it's a very, very splashable one-off card in a lot of decks. But we think when the format settles down after the set is out, there's really only going to be one or two that maybe even consider it. Next up, we have Nessa. Nessa is another supporter card, a really, really interesting one. It's kind of a combination of Rescue Stretcher and Fisherman. Put up to 4 in any combination of water Pokemon and water energy from your discard pile into your hand. So yeah, you can do all energy, you can do all Pokemon, you can do mix and match, which is really, really good. Recovery is always nice to see. We have Ordinary Rod already, but that adds cards to the deck and is limited to 2 and 2 Pokemon and energy. So you're paying that supporter price tag, but this is more flexible, strictly for water decks. The first sort of thing that the biggest application we think is probably going to be Frostmoth decks. This is a very, very nice one-off supporter in Frostmoth decks to be able to get attackers back, things like Wailords, Inteleons, as well as the Moths that go down early on to early bosses, early Zigzagoons, things like that, as well as grabbing some more energy to the hand to be able to immediately power up an attacker with Frostmoth. Also, it is the backbone of the new Cramorant deck that we'll talk about in a little while's time. This new one prize archetype looks unfortunately fairly weak, but Nessa is an integral part of that. But the biggest thing that we could think of outside of the box was actually the Thumping Fall Steelix, the one that has for 2 energy you do 50 times the amount of Pokemon that you discard from your hand with exactly 4 retreat cost. It turns out there's a couple of 4 retreat cost water Pokemon in the game, which is pretty interesting. So if you're looking at Leon saying your attacks do an extra 30 damage, Nessa is technically your attacks do an extra 200 damage for that deck specifically. So in that deck, in that ideal world, it's a pretty interesting card. But in general, it's not going to have, obviously, that doesn't make it a purely 3-star, but it does have a lot of flexibility for these water decks. And I think we consider Frostmoth a sort of lower tier archetype, but a very versatile one. And again, it feels like Frostmoth is just waiting to be broken. I think it took another step up, another step closer with Wailord being released. I think Wailord is actually a really, really strong attacker for the deck. And it feels like we're getting closer and closer. And having this specific support for the Frostmoth deck for water decks is never going to be a bad thing. It's really, really flexible. You're never really going to be too unhappy to see it, especially as we have things like Eldegoss in format anyway, so you can even just discard it earlier on and be able to look for it via Eldegoss later on in the game. So in general, it's a very, very flexible supporter for all water decks. as well as some really, really fun and exciting applications with the Cosmic Eclipse Steelix that has always been a bit of a meme. It turns out that deck actually gets a massive boost from Nessa, so it may not be good, but it's potentially a lot more playable at least.
Next up, we have Opel, a supporter that says, flip 2 coins for each heads, search your deck for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. It's coin flips on a supporter, which already makes me kind of queasy because there's a chance, only 25%, but there is that chance that you've just wasted your supporter for turn. That means as well, though, that there's a 25% chance that you get a very decent effect, a big high roll in those moments where you can piece a couple things together. Obviously, this is able to find special energies, Pokemon, trainers, whatever you need it to be. It is universal search in a way, and if you're just doing it like kind of on pure numbers, just getting that one coin flip heads effect makes it better than Skylar, as long as you're happy to take those risks. Skylar's seeing no play in the format. I believe the format's kind of just got too fast for Skylar. It was really successful the first time around, but since the supporter rule change, Skylar's really not done much. Red's challenge had some highlight reel moments just for extra discard synergy for like Mewtwo decks in early renditions of like towards build of Mewtwo, where you had like Shedinjas and stuff. But since then, neither of those cards have seen too much play. Opel is comparable to these, to be honest, and I'm a risk-averse player anyway, and I think most other people should be when they're trying to build their own decks. So fun high rolls to be had. In general, a slightly improved Skylar, I would say. But with some horrific downsides that can make you lose the game like outright. So let's not take those risks.
Next up, we have Drone Rotom. This is the first of the items. Drone Rotom lets you look at your opponent's hand and the top card of your opponent's deck. A strict upgrade on Handscope. Handscope, unfortunately, never saw play, and I think it's pretty destined for this card to not see too much play either. Obviously, scouting information is good. Having an idea of what your opponent may be doing is bad. It isn't bad, and things like ADP, running more wild and stuff like that. Sometimes you just more wild for information. You may, if you get a Pokemon, that's great, but sometimes more wilding for information is a very, very viable sort of play. But unfortunately, more wild serves more than just an information gathering card, whereas this is literally just an information gathering card. And in today's day and age, we really don't have time to just be playing insta-play information gathering cards, because a lot of the time you really don't mind what your opponent's doing. The format is so centric on build up your own board and develop such a board state that you have this massive Eternatus in play, you're taking 3 prizes on every Dedenne you see, stuff like that. But you don't really mind what your opponent's doing. You don't really need to know their top deck because you know your game plan no matter what happens. So yeah, it's a strict upgrade on Handscope. In things like control decks, it can be sort of a pseudo chip. You don't get to rearrange the top 3, but you can at least have an idea of the kind of resources they're going to have access to. Maybe it tells you whether you want to reset stamp, that kind of thing. And Excadrill, I don't think is a terrible archetype right now. It's not seen too much play recently, but in general, the whole format at the moment is thinking about Players' Cup, where it is a terrible pick in Players' Cup. So I don't think because we haven't seen anything from Excadrill recently, it means the deck is dead. But whilst we have Chip Ice Axe, I'm pretty certain you're just going to be playing that over Drone Rotom because you get to control the top deck, and if everything is going well, your opponent's not going to have a hand anyway. So in general, Drone Rotom is a flashy upgrade on Handscope, but Handscope never saw play, and I don't expect Drone Rotom to either.
Yeah, I actually had to have a little sit down with myself and think, like, is this just strictly better than the second copy of Chip in Excadrill decks? And then I sort of realized that, like, you can get away with one Chip anyway in Drill for the most part, and even then it's questionable whether or not it's better than that second copy. So a lot more thought went into this just regular 1-star than you may think, but it actually, I believe, is not worth any space even in the control stuff. Next up we have Moo Moo Cheese. It's a heal 30 from up to 2 of your Pokemon that have any energies attached to them. So Potion has been power crept. It's finally time, where you can heal 2 targets with a potion. I mean, we all know that this isn't a huge amount of value. It would have to take a lot of sniping decks to be in the format for this to be super relevant. There is the new Telescope tool card that could bring about some extra snipe coverage going on. But if that was the case, a more direct counter would be Mew for the most part. So Moo Moo Cheese still is just too low impact for 1 card.
Next up, we have Hero's Medal, a tool that is very similar to Island Challenge Amulet. Hero's Medal states that the maximum HP of the VMAX this tool is attached to is reduced by 100, and then if the VMAX is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, they take 1 less prize card. You can't knock out a Pokemon. You can't attach this card if it would be knocked out upon attaching it. So they've got around the Jirachi issue that Island Challenge Amulet had. Not that I think it would be too major in this format anyway, but regardless, they've dealt with it, which is good. In general, Island Challenge Amulet in standard saw very, very minor play in like Checkmate and Blounds. It was like a one-off copy in Checkmate so that other ADPs couldn't win the game in a turn after you checkmated them, and it was sometimes like a 1 or 2 of in Blounds just so you could try and get an extra Blound turn. And neither of those were particularly strong applications for the amulet, and as such, I don't think we're really going to see many strong applications for Hero's Medal either. The thing about Hero's Medal is it kind of it forces your opponent to try and go through 3 VMAX Pokemon, trying to take 3 prizes, then 2 prizes, then 3 prizes to do the 8 prize game. But you can kind of do that already with VMAXs if you just play the V Pokemon, because you have to start as a 2 prizer. If they ever have like a boss's orders or anything, you immediately don't need a Hero's Medal to be able to do what the Hero's Medal should be doing. So that is already a very relevant part. But on top of that, you already then have to put another 2 prizer down at some point anyway. So sometimes they can just they can knock out your first one, and then they can just boss around the Hero's Medal and take the same amount of prizes, but on something that you're setting up or anything like that. So the win condition that sort of Hero's Medal develops itself around isn't actually that strong when you have to evolve up into these 3 prize Pokemon anyway. The difference with GXs and EXs was when you put them down, they were 2 prize Pokemon already. There was no more value from dealing with them early or late. You always took 2 prizes from them. Whereas with VMAXs, if you can deal with them early, you get 1 less prize, but it's also a bit of an easier knockout to take. So, and in general, you're stopping your opponent setting up. So even though they are, well, comparable cards, they are identical cards almost, the concept behind them doesn't work as much because VMAXs in the mechanic of VMAXs is very different. So we don't think the card is going to see play anyway. But on top of that, things like Scrapper and stuff just naturally existing means that this card can never be particularly popular, because then Scrapper counts just go up, and Scrapper isn't just a 1-card tech for Hero's Medal. It takes off things like Big Charms, Air Balloons that are really popular right now, random Vitality Bands that start to crop up, Lucky Eggs, all of this random stuff as well. So it's not even a one and done counter, it hits a lot of other things as well. So in general, like these cards are always really, really interesting concepts, and we saw how Island Challenge Amulet broke Expanded, but VMAXs just don't have the same mechanic as GXs and EXs, and because of that, Hero's Medal just doesn't really... It's even worse than Island Challenge Amulet was, and that card was really underwhelming anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, Island Challenge Amulet sort of came out when regular GX Pokemon could be one-shot, and at the moment, outside of hitting for weakness, VMAXs pretty much don't get one-shot. So, like, they're normally sponging 2 hits, and this Hero's Medal puts all of those VMAXs back into that range where they do get one-shot. So you're almost like feeding your opponent those 2 prizes a turn early when you'd rather have it delayed to be 3 prizes over 2 turns. So actually is like actively hurting your deck in terms of most of the time how a prize race will try and go, whilst also being a clunky card in an evolution deck. So many reasons to not like this card. Next up, we have Memory Capsule. This is one of the more interesting ones from the set. We've seen this mechanic on a previous Memory Berry, also Memory Energy and Shrine of Memories. Essentially, this item card, this tool, says that the Pokemon this card is attached to can use any attack from its previous evolutions. You still need the necessary energy. There aren't many synergistic cards currently in the format. There are some decent Vs that can turn into VMAXs, but for the most part, a lot of the Vs are just launch pads to the VMAXs. There aren't many good attacks that you can copy underneath. Salamence V could potentially be one, but if you're playing a Salamence deck, you probably want to have the new Telescope tool anyway for spreading damage even more. There is a new Domfam from the set that can use the Strike Back attack from Fampi, but that's more often than not hoping that your Domfam tanked a hit with only 150 hit points, and you have to think that if that situation ever arises, you're probably already winning the game because you're a 1-prize deck that's able to somehow sponge hits and you're doing like decent 2-shot damage against the majority of things in the format. while setting up damage elsewhere. So it's like a win more card in Domfan, which doesn't make too much sense to me. There is a few of the evolutions as well that synergize specifically with this memory capsule tool, but the fact that we're rating this 1 star should give you an indication of where we're also going to be thinking those abilities are in general. There might be something we've missed with memory capsule. Possibly there are some decent evolutions here and there. I tried to keep an eye on all the VMAXs in general and a decent number of the regular evolution Pokemon, but let's face it, if you're evolving your stuff, you're already committing so many more spaces to comms, Evo incenses, the physical Pokemon themselves. All these other things eat into so many spaces. So weaving in Memory Capsule as well on the off chance that the lower form is actually handy in random spots, it doesn't sit very well with me. So we have to rate it quite low.
Yeah, definitely. It's the kind of card that you probably should keep in the back of your mind if there's ever a really, really good V that also evolves into a really, really good VMAX.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the only one I can think of that is coming out in like February or something is the Cramorant VMAX. That might be one of the only sort of applications, but
even then you want the telescope, right?
Exactly. So even in the perfect situations or the perfect sort of combinations of cards, it's not always the optimal choice. So it's the kind of card that you should probably keep in mind if we ever see a really cool V and VMAX combo. But in general, there's just nothing right now that really can abuse the taking attacks from its previous evolutions. Next up, we have a reprint of Rocky Helmet. This was a card released back in the Black and White days. Rocky Helmet states that if the Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon is damaged by an opponent's attack, put 2 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So it's identical to Horror Energy, but it's obviously universal for every type of Pokemon. Horror Energy is an attachment, so you progress towards your attacks. Rocky Helmet is not. So that immediately makes it worse than Horror Energy. Even though Horror Energy is very specific to Psychic type Pokemon, Rocky Helmet just doing the 2 counters just is not particularly relevant. Horror Energy's 2 counters I've never been irrelevant, but they've never been crazy relevant either. A lot of the time, as we've said, we're doing 2 shots that are sort of 270 dealing with a 340 HP Pokemon. So the extra 2 counters in a lot of scenarios actually isn't that influential. So the fact that Horror Energy sees play is mainly because it is a Psychic Energy with an upside for things like Mewtwo, as opposed to playing basic Psychic Energy. It's not because of the 2 counters, it's just a nice little addition of text. On top of that, like I say, the 2 counters is just not particularly good. We have a plethora of other actually really good tools right now. There's some on the screen that we'll be able to talk about them with the Whimsicott anyway, that we'll talk about later on in the video, but there's also a lot of other good tools regardless that you'd want to see over Rocky Helmet. And because of that, the damage just isn't enough justification to play the card anymore when HP is so high anyway. You'd rather just be, having the utility of free retreat or an extra 50 HP via cape or something like that.
Yeah, I had a little moment again. I had to really think about this card alongside Leon, if it was, again, like a new option for some VMAXs to push you into that sort of 320 range with the combination of them hitting you first and then the Leon happening. But that relies on you drawing the card and them hitting you first, and like not gusting around you or any of that stuff, or having Tool Scrapper. So just being a retroactive tool in the first place makes it quite disadvantageous compared to its other options out there right now. And yes, there is a tool dropping archetype in the format, but I don't think Rocky Helmet even makes the cut. I don't think it's like the 4th best tool even in that deck, so that doesn't bode well. Next up, we have the Telescope Scope. I imagine this will get given different text when we do get in English, but this is actually very interesting card, and one of the cards that was quite hyped by the community, as you can see there. It's a tool that says the attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 30 more damage to your opponent's benched Pokemon V and GX. So it's similar to like a Choice Band, but it's to the bench stuff rather than to the active. And that's actually pretty interesting. We've seen Zigzagoon Scoop Up Net be used in a number of spreading archetypes. We know Inteleon VMAX has used that recently. We know even some Baby Blacephalon sometimes use Scoop Up Net Zigzagoon to make the Cramorant damage sometimes better, but also you do have to bear in mind that Zigzagoon Scoop Up Net is much more universal because the damage can go to face, and Scoop Up Net is also a useful card just because you're playing sometimes Jirachi engines or just giving yourself pivots in general. And Telescope is much more niche in that it's only helping the snipe damage. Another thing to bear in mind that if sniping does become relevant and a big thing, Mew is still in the format. Yes, there's Boss, but that's delaying the entire strategy of a telescope-based build by a turn in many situations. With the sort of negatives out the way... Oh, sorry. I was just going to say one more thing.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, with all those negatives out the way, the damage is actually like super relevant for a couple of big cards. I think the biggest one's Inteleon. Doing 90 pings to V and GXs is huge because you're just having to max bullet 2 times to get through a Crobat or a Dedenne, which is a really big deal. It's what made me have like double Zigzagoon 4 scoop up net in Inteleon, which ate into a lot of spaces. So just having, like 3 telescopes could give you some extra wiggle room and give yourself more sniping presence, which is really cool. And there's a few other kind of more scuffed ones. My biggest issue with Cramorant, although Cramorant's like a very high-profile, good sniper in the game, it's mostly been a sniper in Welder-based decks, and Welder-based decks don't really like having these sorts of random cards that you have to draw into at the right time and put it down, and Cramorant's even a card that you don't really put down until you're having to use it, because bench space is kind of tight for Welder decks, so there's some anti-synergies there. I know on paper you just think like, oh, jumping from 160 to 190 is a big deal, look how much more I can kill now. It's actually not that practical when you look at the way that Cramorant actually plays in the game right now.
Yeah, and alongside that as well, the fact that Dedenne is still in format means that Cramorant has so many targets anyway. It's like exactly Eternatus, where Cramorant feels a bit underwhelming because all of their draw Pokemon are 180 instead of 160. So against exactly Eternatus, Telescope Scope is going to find value, but in a lot of other matchups, there's probably a Dedenne on the board if there's a Crobat on the board. Because in almost every situation, you're probably going to be Dedenneing over Crobatting in first. So yeah, it's a great card for Cramorant, but it's not that Cramorant actually doesn't need the help right now, and like you say, it's pretty anti-synergistic for the Welder decks where you just draw it too early or draw it too late, and it's just not good enough in archetypes that naturally aren't particularly consistent anyway. You don't really want to be putting cards that aren't draw cards or search cards.
There was just one more note to have. There are actually a lot of cards that do full board spreads, and obviously going back to Eternatus, they normally spam a bunch of Crobat and can't really help it. ADPization, they often spam a bunch of Pokemon as well, so we could see some pure spread-only dot decks trying to use the Alolan Sandslash GX that does 100 to each of your opponent's Pokemon that already have damage counters on them. That Telescope going up to 130 on all of those Pokemon means that, just a few pings from Orbital V or a few previous hits from, I don't know, like random Dugongs or Salamence or the new Ampharos. There's a ton of these attacking Pokemon that can do very, very threatening swoop across based attacks. So we're not discounting that. We're just saying that those decks can still have their own weaknesses, and I'm always a pessimist when it comes to spread decks in general because you're not getting hand advantage by taking prizes in a traditional way. So maybe I'm slightly biased in that regard, but it's going to be fun to see how people try and build around the Telescope and how much they lean into it as well.
Definitely. Next up, we're on to the stadiums, and we have Hero's Bath. Basic Pokemon take 20 less damage from your opponent's Pokemon's attacks. There's not too many immediate uses, but the card is obviously just very, very good. Having a natural resistance to everything is always going to be at least worth thinking about. A lot of the time, as we've said, these big 2-shots are doing so much, overkilling so much with the second attack that the damage is kind of irrelevant. But the one deck that really breaks that mold is Lucario Melmetal, where you have the full Metal Wall as well as Metal Goggles. And then Hero's Bath, you can actually turn 2 shots into 3 shots, into maybe even 4 shots because you're just resisting so much. Again, with things like Malolana and stuff as well. For that specific deck, it could be very, very relevant. Whilst there is this sort of area where there are things that can do 260, 270, there will be a lot of situations where the minus 20 doesn't mean anything. But for exactly some of these metal Pokemon, it can be very relevant. Another fun application is the Duraludon V from Champion's Path that a lot of people just completely overlooked. You actually can reduce, after everything, reduce 110 damage before anything, and against grass types 140 damage before they even start doing damage to you. So Duraludon actually becomes pretty tanky, along with some of these other random Metal V Pokemon, things like Zacian, Zamazenta, Lucario Melmetal GX. That's going to be where this card sees play. At the moment, the deck usually runs either sort of Viridian or Swell just to be disruptive, but this is a little bit more proactive. And if you can lock this one in, especially towards the end of the latter stages of the game in comparison with things like Swell, it's going to be pretty influential. Able to pair it with a Stamp, and all of a sudden, it can be really, really difficult to get those last couple of prizes against this kind of deck. And in those attrition-style games, it's often Luca Metal's favor, so this is only going to be beneficial for that deck exactly.
There's one other note that I think is just worth noting is that if ADP continues to just be that sort of like Grinching style deck where it's just trying to do like a boss straight after Ultimate Ray, you can play Hero's Bath in your deck and make them have additional outs. Like it may force Swell in ADP because like Crobats can actually tank hits if Hero's Bath is in. So it could be some really weird scuffed stadium that actually makes this silly boss game plan a lot weaker. Obviously, it doesn't help against the Dene too much, but it could be good against the Heroes Bar. For Crobats, which is just a small note. I don't think it'll actually be that relevant, and ADP still only takes up like 20% of the meta maximum, but it's just a small note I wanted to have because that's a pretty relevant archetype. Next up, we have Wyndham Stadium. We've seen its synergy with the League staff, but obviously that's a terrible supporter. And unfortunately, this stadium doesn't have too many applications either. When you play a Pokemon VMAX to evolve, one of your V Pokemon heal 100 damage from it. Just the way damage is working in the format right now, there aren't too many attackers that sort of go for a little prod, and then that prod is enough for them to instantly knock out the VMAX the following turn. It would only really be like setup damage if you're playing like Sableye V, or if you were some of these one prize decks that try and do a little prod earlier on, and then their damage scales as sort of the game progresses. Like Mad Party, you get a handful in the discard pile and you can prod an Eternatus or whatever, and then the following turn you can finish it off because you've reached a 200 or so damage cap in like the following turn. So Wyndham is good for exactly those situations, but I think most VMAXs that we have in the format, like Eternatus right now is maining Power Plant quite a lot. Sometimes it's also playing Dark City or Viridian. Center Scorch obviously still wants to play Giant Hearth, so there aren't many outright strong VMAXs, and obviously Inteleon doesn't want to play this either. It'll probably play Training Court or Viridian of its own, that even have the utility to free up a stadium space in the first place. And if you're going to, I don't think you really need to counter these sort of lower tier archetypes in the first place.
Onto the special energy, and the first one is Aroma Grass energy. Aroma Grass, as long as when you attach it, if it's attached, you can't be affected by special conditions, and then you remove all special conditions as well. And it also obviously works as a grass type energy. Obviously, that's only for grass type Pokemon. In general, I think the grass type special energy has been pretty underwhelming both times we've seen it. It was a heal 20 when it was first released, and now it's just a remove special conditions. There are certain situations where special conditions are relevant. The poison-based Eternatus build is becoming more and more popular, alongside Pikachu becoming a little bit more popular, Pikarom becoming a little bit more popular as well, with the Choo-Choo's Tandem Shock paralyzing. That's not irrelevant. It's not like status is nowhere to be seen, but in general, it's not particularly popular either, and this only works for grass types, and in general, there aren't very many good grass type decks out there at the moment. The only build around grass type Pokemon right now is Rillaboom. We'll talk about another one in a few moments' time, but in general, you're probably not going to be attacking with that one either. It's more of a support Pokemon. So paired with the fact that the effect isn't that strong, along with the Pokemon that you want to attach it to, Aroma Grass is pretty underwhelming. Again, nice to have if all of a sudden there's a lot of special conditions and a very, very strong grass deck. You may want to think about playing some of the special grass energy, but more often than not, it's actually the grass decks doing special conditions. So it's kind of held itself back. But if grass gets good, the energy gets good sort of twofold, because a lot of the time these grass decks do weird special condition stuff. But right now, it's just very, very underwhelming. You're not going to want to put this in your deck over basic energy, and on top of that, there aren't really any decks to even put it in right now.
Next up, we have Coating Metal. This one seems a lot more promising, simply because there are some immediate homes for the card. Coating Metal says, while this is attached to a Pokemon, it provides metal energy. If it's a metal Pokemon that's attached to, that metal Pokemon has no weakness. So we can breathe a sigh of relief. Luke Metalization really did miss the fact that they had the frying pan to protect themselves against the fire decks. Now we get it in the form of coating metal energy. Luke Metal often is an archetype that is playing Tag Call Engine, so you can Guz Hala the card out, which means you don't need to play like a full 4 count, which is good because the Zacian deck still want to play a decent number of basic metal energies, so you can Intrepid Sword and so that you can get early Sorcerer value. But playing 3 of these could be a lot of peace of mind, a lot of defense against Senti, a lot of defense against even Baby Blacephalon, which is traditionally one of your hardest matchups regardless, and that still will be the case, but you at least make it a game and make them hit higher numbers and actually draw more than just like 3 energies to bop you turn by turn. So the coating metal is a huge sigh of relief for Luke Metal. I think that's really been the only Achilles heel of the archetype in the format right now. I think a lot of people respect it has a decent time against ADP and Eternatus, and a solid time against the Inteleon decks as well. It's really just the fire stuff that is the problem, and Mewtwo to some extent because they already run fire attackers as well. So sort of patching that up is going to be a real big coup for the Luke Metalization deck. And another quick note on a sort of Turbozation approach as well. I loved playing just straight Zacian with Jirachi Prism Star, and we now have a potential alternate option, which is using Bayonet to devolve your opponent's benched evolve stuff. And if you play it with like Boss's Orders or Fiones, you can hit stuff with Brave Blade, pick, and then force the opponent to pick up their damage V maxes to then knock out the V that's underneath them with the Brave Blade math. And having a pure Zacian build will also really appreciate the coating metal. We've given it the high rating just because of Luke Metal is guaranteed to be very, very good, so it has an immediate home. We don't think this is good enough to be an ADP because ADP is already playing split energies and you want all of those to be basics. So I think it's exactly that home where we're going to see it most.
Definitely. Luke Metal right now is already playing sometimes none, but sometimes up to 3 weak guard energy, and this is strictly weak guard with weak guard that is a metal energy. So this is like, there's no way this doesn't see play in Luke Metal immediately if they're playing weak guards anyway. But I think even straight basic lists would probably still put this in because it just means, like you say, Senti Scorch is actually a real game now, which is good. Next up, we have Stone Fighting Energy. Stone Fighting Energy provides a fighting energy to whatever it's attached to, and if it's a fighting Pokemon, the Pokemon takes 20 less damage. So again, it's a bit like Heat Fire, an extra 20 HP. In this case, it's a minus 20 damage. In a lot of scenarios, that's actually better because if they have to, unless they're one-shotting you, it's actually technically an extra 40 HP because they have to go through this Stone Fighting Energy twice. So that's pretty good, along with not being not sort of being caught by if they've done so much damage that they've overkilled you apart from the energy. If they then get rid of the energy, you're knocked out. So this effect is strictly better than increasing HP because it's kind of like double, potentially increasing HP twice. So the effect is really, really strong, and because of that, it's got a fairly high rating. Unfortunately, there's not that many great targets for fighting energy right now, and as we mentioned earlier on, even though we've got 3 of the best ones on here, the fighting archetypes are fantastic for dealing with Eternatus and Pikarom, but they really fall short in terms of other decks, in other matchups. And because of that, it's difficult to really back some of these fighting archetypes if you're just basically purely basing it off of trying to hit Eternatus and Pikarom, because that'll be a fair few of your rounds of tournaments, things like that. But at the same time, some of these decks really, really falter against things like ADP, Luke Metal. A lot of the time Senti Scorch is more efficient than them, that kind of thing. So it's not that this card is bad, it's that the potential decks that this card would be put in really don't look to be massively meta breaking. Expect a lot of highlight reel moments from the decks themselves, just because fighting does get a lot of cool support in this set, and Colossal VMAX is actually a really, really cool Pokemon, and I expect to see a lot of play, but I don't think it will have such a great win rate compared to some of the other decks in the format. And as such, because none of these decks will have great win rates, Stone Fighting Energy is a really, really good card, just at a really, really bad time. A lot of the time, also, things like the 210, 230 from Rhyperior, sometimes you're going to need 1 or 2 of these Stone Fighting Energy, or the Stone Fighting Energy, as well as some kind of tool to even be getting out of things like Zacian range anyway. So a lot of the time it's not just stone fighting energy. You're going to need to have it with a big charm or a toughness cape or another stone fighting energy, that kind of thing, and that can make things a little bit awkward. But again, we've given it a fairly high, well, a 3-star rating simply because the card itself is so strong. Any fighting deck that is very, very relevant over the next couple of years is probably going to be playing this card just because it's never particularly a downside. Things like Welder, you need basic energy. Frostmoth, you need basic energy. There's not much fighting acceleration right now that needs specifically basic energy. And as such, you can get away with playing these special energy and getting that additional bonus of an extra resistance, which is really, really nice. So yeah, it's a card that we definitely expect to see play at some point. And despite fighting probably being the best type to be right now in terms of dealing with some of the strong archetypes, there's just not that many great fighting Pokemon, and as such, there's not many great homes for stone fighting energy.
Yeah, I actually think this carries Colossal, to be honest. I didn't think Colossal was a good enough card in a vacuum without the reduction that Stone Fighting provides. I think that actually gives you a passable matchup against ADP. Now, I haven't played it a huge amount, and Eruption Blast is still mediocre damage, and you need to keep feeding yourself energies turn by turn, so there are headaches there. But those reductions mean that you can actually get value from like Malolana and stuff like that. So that's actually low key the reason why Colossal will see a decent amount of play in the format. So this is like an unsung hero, and is really the thing that's going to keep Colossal afloat, I think, in the format. We have the final special energy card, the Wash Water Energy. We've basically seen this from Wonder Energy in the past. This time it's a water version. So this provides a water, and if it's attached to a water Pokemon, prevent all the effects of attacks from your opponent's Pokemon's attacks. So yeah, you are just ignoring a bunch of annoying afflictions that could come across. But as we all know, we said it with the fire energy, we said it with the grass energy. Basic water is just pretty broken right now. It can be bucketed, it can be ice danced, it can be Nessa'd, it can be training courted. So yeah, all of those things just strictly outweigh the benefits of this special energy. And obviously, specials come with their own heap of downsides anyway, with like Giratina, Scoop Up Net still being a combo in the format. So yeah, basic water is just far more broken than wash water, unfortunately.
And that's it for the trainers and energy. Onto the Pokemon, the first of which we have is Beedrill. Beedrill has a very, very similar ability to a Pokemon we've seen in the past, Elusive Master, from the Greninja GX from Detective Pikachu. Once during your turn, if this card is the only card in your hand, you may play it onto your bench, then draw 3 cards. Obviously, Greninja never saw masses and masses of play. It actually mainly saw play for its Mist Slash attack. But there were niche situations where you ended up with a hand that led you to having a lone Greninja in your hand, and you got to draw 3 cards, and that was really, really great. But the point was, Greninja was played for Mist Slash that had this really cool line of text that did that got you to draw an extra 3 cards. Beedrill does not have that reason to play it. The only reason to play it is to draw 3 cards, and right now there's so many different ways of drawing cards. It's just really not worth trying to build around a Beedrill engine. If you were to build around a Beedrill engine, though, you do have things like Scoop Up Net and Turffield to search it out. Scoop Up Net to pick it up and play it down again. Turffield and Evo Incense to search it out. So it's actually fairly searchable, but getting down to 0 cards, like I say, it was never a goal for the Mewtwo decks that played Greninja to get down to 3 cards, to no cards to draw 3 with Elusive Master. It was just a really, really nice sort of pat on the back for being able to play your hand well and get to that situation. But you cared about the Mist Slash attack, and as such, you really don't care about anything else about this card other than Elusive Master, and as such, it's not going to be a particularly good build-around card for any deck, really. It has a decent amount of searchability, but it's just not really ever going to be good enough in terms of a deck's archetype, a deck's engine, really.
Yeah, I think Rose Towers proved that going below 3 cards is few and far between, at least in the early turns. And if it's late on, it's kind of random that this is just the card that you draw, even if you're playing Oranguru stuff. I do like that it has free retreat, so if you are getting those hand advantages or whatever, it's then like not just a complete wasted space on the board. And there is a lot of people crying out that we're not as reliant on just Crobatting and just Adenaying, and then being able to, ADP just punishes you immediately. So there's a creative way around it, but I think it's not enough cards, and it's still difficult to manipulate your hand into being just this guy, and then he drops down to give you value. So cute card, not enough payoff, and still too difficult to achieve. Next up, we have the first of the Amazing Rares. This is a new, I guess, mechanic or just a new type of card that we're getting from Vivid Voltage. I think mostly a collector piece. As you can see by the artwork, you're getting this strange sort of textured rainbow effect with these cards. And the main gimmick that I'm seeing with the Amazing Rares is that they all have kind of rainbow-colored energy attachments with the majority of their attacks. And in the competitive TCG, that normally spells bad news because there's fewer and fewer decks that can accommodate for those sorts of attacks. Celebi comes with the Energy Press attack, which is probably the most interesting one. You do 30 times the number of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. We've seen similar renditions of this with the Victini V and most recently the Mew V, but both of those cards incorporate their own energy attachments, which gives you like a decent baseline to work off of. Celebi, much more reliant on your opponent really overcommitting with energy attachments, and I don't foresee that happening too much. Grass typing as well, not super relevant. You're not hitting many things for weakness. Now there is the new Colossal, which is weak to Grass, but again, I don't think Colossal is going to be so mind-blowing that Energy Press is going to start becoming crazy, especially because Colossal is one of those cards that doesn't need many energies to function in the first place, so that's a bit of a problem. Then we have the second attack, Amazing Bloom for Lightning and Psychic. You get to search your deck for a card that evolves from each of your bench Pokemon and play those cards on top of those Pokemon to evolve them. We've seen this effect with Leafeon GX, with that Grand Bloom GX attack, and I've previously been baited by that effect of an attack, but it's not going to happen twice. I think that is just a super slow effect. It's 2 attachments in the first place. You need to already have filled your board with stuff just waiting to evolve, and then you need to be playing an evolution deck on top of all that stuff, and you need to have multiple energy attachments. So you're running rings around like your own deck just to then get like a very mediocre effect. It's way easier for you to just commit your deck to more ball search cards in the first place to help you evolve. So yeah, no real effect from that Amazing Bloom.
Definitely, it is worth noting. We don't specifically talk about expanded in these too much, but it is worth noting an expanded counter energy is accessible for all of these different amazing rares. So don't write them off in expanded because there may be combinations that we haven't thought of because Joe and myself don't particularly think about expanded too much, but don't write them off completely. There may be really, really broken stuff you can do with maybe not the Celebi because a lot of the format it still revolves around basic Pokemon and expanded, but there's a couple we'll talk about, a couple of attackers that actually have really, really strong attacks. It's just in standard they're held back by this sort of rainbow energy cost. But in expanded you have access to loads of different things, prism energy, counter energy, all sorts. So yeah, that's worth noting when looking at all of these amazing rare cards. Next up we have a pair of cards, Ninjask and Shedinja. Both of these usually have kind of similarities to one another and help each other out. And that's the same here. Ninjask has the Cast Off Shell ability. Once during your turn, when you play a card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may search your deck for a Shedinja and put it onto the bench, then shuffle your deck. On the Shedinja that you search out is probably going to be this really, really strange Shedinja that is considered a basic Pokemon but has the ability Shed Binding, meaning they can only be put into play by Cast Off Shell from Ninjask. It's very, very strange that they've done this. It's very bizarre for this not to be a Stage 1 Pokemon. Shedinja has always been a Stage 1 Pokemon, I'm pretty sure, in the game. So it's very, very strange for them to call it a basic and then have to add this line of text saying that you can't play it during setup. So yeah, that's all really, really weird. But the payoff of the card is the Squeezing the Life attack for 3 colorless energy. Put damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon until its remaining HP is 10. Now, this would be great, again, if Shedinja was a Stage 1 Pokemon, because you could use something like Triple Acceleration, and all of a sudden you could have Triple Acceleration plus something that poisons, something like Garbodor or Slowbro V, and be able to knock out anything in a turn, especially when we have things like Eternatus VMAX with 340 HP, all of a sudden this random 30 HP Pokemon could be doing 340 damage in a turn. That'd be really cool, but unfortunately, Shedinja is, again, for some bizarre reason, a basic Pokemon. And as such, there's no great, nice, really, really strong acceleration specific for this Shedinja can work with, which is kind of, it's pretty underwhelming when it's got the liabilities of a Stage 1 Pokemon because you have to get the Stage 1 Ninjask out, and then you don't get the payoffs of being a Stage 1. You can't use things like Triple Acceleration or Evo Incense or anything like that. to try and increase your consistency of getting these Shedinjas out particularly well. So it's a really, really sort of oddball combination of lines of text that we see on the card. And when we have Kartana that has False Swipe that does the same thing for a coin flip, now it does have a worse energy attachment or energy cost, but it's not a stage 1, and we have ways of manipulating coin flips, and that's seeing no play. It's seen highlight reel moments, but nothing more than that. It's like a long and drawn out way of playing the Kartana that's already very, very underwhelming. So yeah, really, really, there's a lot of potential in these cards, and it could have been a really, really interesting one prize meta breaker deck, but instead they just made it really, really bizarrely. They worded things really, really bizarrely, and unfortunately we just got really, really underwhelming results because of it.
Yeah, and even then it's got 30 hit points, so there's all those snipers, all those Zigzagoon net sort of decks that can always punish you. I think the Ninkadas as well have like pitiful hit points. So if you're going for these, put your opponent to 10 style approaches, I think Kartana's still the best one that we have access to, and that's doing absolutely nothing. Next up we have Beetle V and VMAX. This actually upsets me to put this as a 2-star card because holy, I've tried so hard to try and make this archetype a thing. I'm trying all sorts of different ways in my head, theory crafting, and none of them seem all that good. Let's jump into the VMAX though. It's a 310 hit point VMAX, which is actually quite squishy, and it is weak to fire. So straight away we have to say yikes, because it's an easy giveaway for the fire decks that you're just going to get kind of slaughtered by them just outright. It has the World Beam ability, which is the real selling point of the card. Once during a turn, when this is your active Pokemon, you may put 1 counter on each of your opponent's Pokemon. And then it has the G-Max Wave attack. For a grass and colors, you do 50 plus 50 times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. There's a lot of decks that attach 3 energies. There's also a good number that are just 2 energy attachment decks. So you're looking around that sort of 150 to 200 mark. Now, bear in mind that you are a grass type and Zacian resists you, so already that's a problem. Even a few World Beams don't put you in range just yet, just by that awful typing that you have as Orbeetle. So actually quite a bit of a headache. The regular V has a couple decent attacks. It's got, again, 180 hit points, which is just pitiful. Strafe does 20, and you can protect yourself, which is nice. You can protect your early game attachment if need be. It's got the Mystery Wave attack, which is 50 plus 30 times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active, so very similar to the G-Max Wave. But really the selling point has to be this World Beam, right? We have to think that a 1 retreat cost Pokemon that you can U-turn board, you can play a bunch of Bird Keepers and switches. You have Turfield, which makes this quite an easily accessible Stage 1 Pokemon. You have to try and build around that World Beam and just say that you're going to try and get multiple procs of this. You'll set up 2 Orbeetles, you'll start your turn with a World Beam, you'll move into the other one, do a World Beam, and then switch again to get into an attacker of sorts, or just attack with one of them outright and just sort of pivot between them. I've thought about a straight Orbeetle deck, which is playing like as many as possible, and then having possibly the Zarude V in here as well for healing / acceleration, but I'm still not convinced that that's going to do well, and obviously that'll be abysmal against fire stuff with no real answer. So then you're sort of looking towards Orbeetle being like a package to make these sorts of telescope spread decks a thing, or possibly a new option for Sableye V. Previously, Sableye has just tried to use like Arctozolt, or it's tried to use Flapple, or it's tried to just go with Ziggy Scoop Up Nets and Roxy and stuff. Potentially, we get to this point where Orbeetle is just enough damage that it becomes the best answer for Sableye. But it's all like a lot of work, a lot of setup, and then you're just being like less consistent than the majority of other successful decks that we have in the format. So yeah, ultimately very skeptical that this is going to work out, but man, it's a creative card, and I am going to still put myself through the ringer to try and make sure that it's not actually that good, because I have hope, but not too much expectation for the card.
Yeah, it's really weird that they decided to keep it capped at 1 damage counter. I mean, it could never have been anything more than 1 damage counter, because that would be crazy good. But at the same time, 1 damage counter in a format full of 340 HP Pokemon, 1 damage counter is sometimes really, really underwhelming. So you then have to really lean into the damage counter being placed on things like the Denes and Crobats and trying to get value there. So yeah, a really, really interesting card, and a real shame that it's not immediately just straight out the gate, this is how you play it, and it's actually a very, very strong archetype, like things like Senti and Eternatus were when they came out. It's going to take a lot of thinking, but it's definitely got a lot of potential, and it looks to be really, really fun, if nothing else. Next up, we have Shiftry. Shiftry has a really, really interesting ability, Tengu Substitute. While this Pokemon is in your active spot, all effects of the supporter cards in your opponent's hand become draw 3 cards. So your opponent can't use Boss, your opponent can't use Marnie, your opponent can't use Research. They just have to use Hop all the time. And whilst you may think that's really rubbish, when they can't use Boss, they can't gust up something else. So in all honesty, your opponent probably will just be using Hop for the majority of the game, because until they start knocking out the Shiftries, they don't really have great gusting. If you're not playing down GX Pokemon for them to gust around with the Great Catcher, there's really not that many other ways of gusting that we're seeing in format right now. And because of that, you will genuinely disrupt your opponent with this ability. The issue is, it's a Stage 1 Pokemon it's a Stage 2 Pokemon that's just, again, we're in a format where Stage 2 Pokemon are really, really struggling to exist right now, unless they're doing some form of denial, i.e. Obstagoon or Decidueye, that kind of thing. Or they're very on the back burner, like Colossal, for example, where your opponent has to forget about them because they're dealing with an attacker. Because Shiftry has to be in the active spot, it has to be in the line of fire, and as such, it kind of trips itself up, because you want to be able to protect your Shiftry and disrupt your opponent, but you have to put it into the active in the line of fire, which is pretty awkward. You could maybe use this as a hit and run target, but we have so many walls in the format right now. A lot of the random walls, things like Dolls, as well as things like Altaria, are just going to be probably more disruptive, if not just at least as disruptive, sometimes even more disruptive than just stopping your opponent from drawing 3 cards. Given that we also have things like Dedenne and Crobat in format as well, they can still draw more than 3 cards in a turn. It's not like you're capping your opponent at drawing 3 cards. We have plenty of ways of drawing cards right now. So it's a really, really exciting and cool ability, and I actually really, really think it's creative. But because it's a Stage 2 and the attack isn't great, 2 for 110, very efficient, but at the same time, it's a Stage 2 with a 2 energy attack cost. It's just not going to be sort of consistent enough for the downside you put on your opponent to ever be worth building around.
We move on to Zarude V. I kind of touched on it when talking about that Orbeetle VMAX. It's a 210 hit point basic grass type. Again, weak to fire, yikes. But it has 2 attacks, both costing 2. The first one for 2 colorless is Bind Down. You do 50 and prevent retreating. And then we have the Jungle Rise attack, probably the most interesting one here. For 2 grass, you do 100, and you can attach up to 2 basic energy cards from your hand to your bench in any way that you like, and then heal all damage from those Pokemon. So if you were hoping to play multiple Orbeetle VMAX, you could try and use the Zarude V as an attacking presence. So you're basically spamming World Beams all the time, and then just sort of letting an Orbeetle get hit, and then you retreat that Orbeetle, go into Zarude, and Jungle Rise to heal off those Orbeetles, whilst also powering them up for G-Max waves on future turns. That's kind of a nice niche thing I can see here. I can't see much else for the card. I mean, its damage output as 100 isn't really good, like, at all. It's not even reaching 2 shots on most V Pokemon. You're way out for VMAXs, so it definitely needs some supplementary damage going on in here if it's ever going to work. Or it's going to be one of these sorts of things that sort of finishes off an attacker. Potentially this could be a sort of mediary card for a Rillaboom VMAX, Rillaboom V deck, where once you've done a huge max beating, you haven't quite finished off a VMAX on your opponent's end, but your Rillaboom is still standing as well. Potentially you can go into Zarude, use your Stage 2 Rillaboom to attach to Zarude V, and then Jungle Rise to heal your VMAX, whilst also setting it up for a future max beating the following turn. Now, that's a huge dream situation. All of those things have to come into combination with one another for it to actually work. And we've seen that Rillaboom V Max and Stage 2 Rillaboom has been a lot of work in the first place. Now, this does make it dangerous and does give the archetype a win condition, but it's still going to be hella clunky, and that makes me worried. But it's going to be fun to try out Rillaboom again, just with like 2 copies of the Zarude. Maybe that's enough to push it and give it enough win conditions against enough decks, but you're still a Stage 2 and a Stage 1 deck, and your damage output is still kind of meh. So We still are rating it low, but we can see some potential in the card for some synergies going on.
For sure. Onto the fire Pokemon, and we have Charizard as the first. Charizard is actually a really, really interesting one prize attacking Pokemon. It could see a new one prize attacking deck break into the format. It has 170 HP and a pretty cool ability, Battle Sense. Once during your turn, you may look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose a card you find there, put it into your hand, and discard the other cards. So great discard synergy. Things like fire energy that you can discard and then get back with fire crystal, things like getting the Leons into the discard pile to be able to do more damage with King's Blaze, which does 100 for 2, plus 50 more for each Leon in your discard pile. You can kind of see the synergy there. In general, it may seem like this ability is a downside, discarding 2 cards of your deck every turn, but you're getting to pick the best one, and that's really good for these sort of stage 1 or one prize stage 2 attacking decks, because you need to be keeping up with consistency whilst also doing other things like Boss, Marnie, Welder, Leon, all of these or very, very slow draw supporters, sometimes not draw supporters at all. You still need some kind of added consistency. So every Charizard you get out, you're increasing your deck's consistency because you have a new consistency ability. So the ability is really, really strong. I like it a lot. And as I mentioned, King's Blaze can do a maximum of 330 damage, 360 if you can somehow Surge Leon. That would be cool. But yeah, 330, 300 is probably where you're going to be looking at. All of that damage is really, really impressive. It can at least threaten close to a one-shot, if not a one-shot, on a lot of the VMAXs. And with the Leon's supplementary damage, you can knock out almost all of the VMAXs. Maybe you're playing 1 or 2 Zigzagoons as well to potentially push your way into Eternatus range, and all of a sudden you have a one prize Pokemon that can knock out Eternatus. That's pretty cool. Obviously, again, as I mentioned with the Shiftry, these stage 2s you have to really take with a grain of salt because they can be inconsistent. But like I say, the ability definitely helps a lot in helping your consistency, as well as digging through your deck and getting rid of loads of the sort of rubbish cards that you don't want to be stamped into, because another big pain in the or thorn in the side of these stage 2 decks is being stamped or Marnied late game. Well, now you can, as soon as you start setting up the Charizard, you can draw 3 cards, discard 2 of them, look at 3 cards, discard 2 of them, and start getting rid of the bad cards that you don't want to see from stamps or Marnies. So it's very, very strong. I like the ability, and the attack can provide a lot of damage. We have things like Poker Gear, even the Magneton that's been seeing a lot of play recently. You can Magneton to search out for some supporters and then discard them, or we can search out for like double Leon research or something, which would be pretty interesting to be able to boost King's Blaze's damage up. Unfortunately, it is too energy, so you are going to have to still play this Welder package and weave in Welders here and there. And as such, maybe you're going to have to go down this Magneton route just to be able to play some kind of Surge combination in order to be able to do everything in your turn, Welder, Boss, Welder, Leon, that kind of stuff. But as in terms of a one prize archetype, this is really, I think there's a lot of potential here. It's fairly easy to understand as well. I think it's going to be a really nice budget deck to get into. We've seen that this Charizard is one of the theme decks, so you can pick up a couple of theme decks for like $25-$30, and you're probably very close to a functioning standard deck already. And it probably also means that Leon may be in the theme decks as well, which is great for everyone just having access to Leon. So yeah, really, really pleased to see this card. It's nothing groundbreaking. The 3-star is basically at least a limitation from us because it's a stage 2 and it's fairly inconsistent, getting 300 every turn when you have to Welder every turn and that kind of thing. But, the Roaring Resolve Charizard saw niche play, and it was never great, but it was never terrible. And that's kind of where we feel this Charizard is going to fall into as well. Decent ability, very strong for consistency, and a really strong attack, just held back by the fact it's a stage 2.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting card. I like that it has a base of 100 damage, so even if you're not starting your sort of mini quest of finding and binning Leons, you're at least able to initiate a trade, so then when your next Charizard comes into the active, that second King's Blaze will finish off some things. Even like VMAXs can get finished off after a two-shot, and then your late game is insane as Charizard. You're really insane. If you haven't prized your Leons and you've been able to pick them out of the deck with early Magnetons or Pokegears, or even just battle sensing them into the discard pile, you can combine it with a Rangaroo if you want to guarantee you're chucking Leons. You're pretty stamp proof for the most part. You have an ability as well that sort of sees you through. So, man, your early game is treacherous, but if Charizard gets to the late game, it's actually one of the most dangerous decks. There'll just be those decks who are like, oh man, Charizard hit well on the early 2 or 3 turns, and then you can't beat them because those Leons are just stuck there. All they need is a Welder and another attachment. They've got Battle Sense to fall back on, and there's nothing you can actually do about that. So I'm excited to play it out. It feels like Baby Blounds to me, but you don't have the late game issues. There's more high rolling for the early turns, but if you navigate those early turns, there's actually nothing your opponent can do against you, which is a pretty solid feeling. Next up, we have the first of the 3 evolutions that combine with this Memory Capsule, the tool card. This Flareon has the Burning Awakening ability. If this Pokemon has Memory Capsule attached, both players' grass Pokemon have no abilities. So it's a Garbotoxin, but specifically for one type. And that already means that this is a useless combination in your deck in a lot of matchups. It's really... Eldegoss is the only universally good grass card, and then it's only really Rillaboom decks and Orbeetle, which we don't have much hope for in this format right now, which makes me think, man, Flareon is not going to be useful at all. As a tech option, it takes up too many spaces because you're a stage 1 and you need to play tool cards, which is multiple. When Garbrill was played, you had to play Floatstones, and Floatstones are good in any situation, so although you were eating up spaces of your deck, you would have to play Floatstone anyway, so Garbrill was just a 2-2 count, whereas the Flareon is probably a 2-2, plus these Memory Capsule cards, which are trash in every other situation, and because it's type-specific, it's only useful in exactly those sorts of matchups, and I don't foresee any deck not being able to beat Rillaboom or Orbeetle without the help of this Burning Awakening ability. There are other tech cards that you can go for. There are other ways around these grass Pokemon. So, yeah, the Flareon is really bad, and just a general note on the other evolutions that we'll talk about later, these are so narrow and niche that it's difficult to foresee any of them doing well. Even if you jam 2 EV and 1 of each evolution into one deck and then just have the Memory Capsules, that's still 7 spaces of a deck, and it's still just a handful of archetypes. Garbodor was universally bonkers, so these really are a poor comparison, I would say.
The only other one that is worth noting is Decidueye, but in general, Decidueye is still seeing play, but there's more and more people playing, or there's now the option to play Altaria. And if ever Flareon is somehow very, very relevant, people will just move to Altaria and still be able to lock you. So the only other one is Decidueye, but even as a Decidueye counter, there's not many decks that just hard lose to a Decidueye. There's in almost every deck there's usually some kind of one prize attacker that you can.
Yeah, less spaces than Memory Capsule, probably.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's not too many uses for the evolutions that we can see. Next up, we have Talonflame V, a really interesting V Pokemon. Talonflame V's first attack, you'll remember from the Beauty support earlier on. Fast Flight lets you use this on your first turn, discard your hand and draw 6 cards. So it's the Dene's ability on an attack, but you can do it turn 1. And that's actually pretty good. Being able to just draw an extra 6 cards, we've seen that initially things like Dedenne, where you have to discard your hand, you may be like, I don't want to do that. But sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and do it. And similarly, I don't think you're ever going to be in a situation where you want to Dedenne, but you wouldn't want to Talonflame. That would be a really, really weird situation. So the ability is not strictly as good as Dedenne's ability. The attack, is not strictly as good as Dedenne's ability because you can still do stuff after the ability, but it is still very good. So yeah, definitely a great ability to build around. It also has free retreat, which is obviously a brilliant addition. It means that you can start this fairly happily and you don't have to find a switch or anything. You can immediately just switch out of there next turn, which is great. So you now have a reason. It's another reason to go first, which is pretty cool. You can energy switch the energy off, so it's not necessarily a wasted attachment. So yeah, in general, it's just increasing a lot of consistency. which is great. You can pair it in, you can play it in things like the Mad Party deck to get some extra discard. A lot of the time, the deck kind of doesn't care what the first 35, 40 cards of the deck are. It just wants to bin them all because the majority of them will be Mad Partiers, and then settle with like a 15, 20 card deck and just hope there's a lot of energy in there and enough attackers. So it's sort of more reason to play that, more an extra reason to play those types of archetypes. It's not too relevant. If you're going second, you don't get the extra line of text saying you can use it first. And I don't think there's many decks that would play this because the format is so sort of important that you get your energy on turn 1 to your main attacker, that you force yourself to find an energy switch turn 2. Things like ADP wouldn't really want to play this because you already have to find an energy switch on turn 2 or on turn 1 if you're going second, or a second one, or one anyway on turn 2 if you then use Fast Flight. Eternatus can't play this. Things like Pikarom really don't want to be giving up energy attachments, though actually it's not like there's a fair bit of discard synergy with Pikarom, so maybe you could try it out on Pikarom or something like that. I think the attack is very flashy, and there will definitely be some uses for it. The fact that this is just like a perfect setup card, having free retreat, a universal attack, and a colorless attack cost is all really, really great. The difficulty I see is exactly where to put this card. There's not a huge amount of archetypes that I think you're better off attaching to a Talonflame instead of just attaching to your main attacker to set up for the next turn. So it's in a really weird spot where I think this line of text like a year ago would have been crazy. It would have seen play in absolutely everything. And you can see from the community pie chart, there's a lot of people, the opinion is really, really divided on this card. Everyone thinks it's going to be at least playable. Some people think it's even going to be a staple in multiple archetypes. And I think that's just how good that fast flight attack is. It's very difficult to predict where this will land. But I think it will fall short in a lot of situations just because the format is so aggressive. You need to be setting up your attacker and attacking turn 2 no matter what. And if you need to find an energy switch, like ADP doesn't like having to play energy switch. It just can high roll the turn 1 ADP GX attack as such, because sometimes you need to be able to keep up with this format. And forcing yourself to have to find an energy switch to keep up with attachments on your main attacker can be pretty awkward at times. So yeah, it's a very interesting card, and I think the community rating kind of shows how vastly opinionated people are about this. Some people think it's going to be great. Some people think it's going to be underwhelming. I think it's ultimately going to fall short of the bar, but it's one that's for sure I'll be keeping an eye on, and I think it's worth thinking about when trying to build a deck, because having Fast Flight as your early turn sort of build around way to accelerate through your deck, so you have a reason to go first and a reason to go second, is definitely nothing to sniff at.
Yeah, I just like its versatility as an option. It's a free retreat pivot, so it's a new optimal starter for you in every situation. It's a colorless attack cost, so it's usable. I think there'll be a handful of decks that will prefer this to using the new Snorlax or using Zacian to end your turn on an Intrepid Sword. You can just go for a Fast Flight instead, and then you've got the benefit of a free pivot in every other situation. So it's like you can lead out the Talonflame and then still not ever use it again, outside of just being like, okay, send him up again. I'll do my, and then just have the option to retreat at any point in the turn. So yeah, he's a pretty cool guy. It was interesting to look at the community's response to this card, because we were also just like, okay, so the text is clearly good, but where? And that's that's the last question that we have to ask, really. We move on to the water stuff now. We start off with the Stage 1 Barraskewda. It's a 120 hit point water type with the Eyeing Skewered attack. For 1 water, you do 20. To one of your opponent's bench Pokemon times the number of damage counters already on that Pokemon. So it's the same text as Esper's Ear Kinesis from Unbroken Bonds, and really you're trying to cash in on something that you've previously hit or done some setup damage to, and then sort of doubling down on that damage and finishing them off for sometimes quite a lot of damage, all with just one attachment. I think what's interesting to me is the Cramorant style archetype. I believe this archetype's going to be quite niche, but I can definitely foresee Cramorant not finishing off things on certain turns, and you're naturally playing a bunch of Arrokudas. So keeping one available on your board that if your opponent does retreat out means that you don't need to play a boss's orders in that deck at all if you just play that high Nessa count, and then you play like 3 water energy and like 2 Barrascudas or something, you can then be like, okay, cool, I'll Fione, eyeing skewered the thing that I've pushed to the bench, or if they've retreated, you can just evolve up, attach, and eyeing skewered again. So I think that's something that's very cute for that archetype, and not something I've seen many people talk about. I think the Cramorant will still be like kind of meme garbage or whatever, but the Barrascuda makes it quite interesting. And if you're going to talk about more spreading stuff, we've already sort of dunked on Orbeetle. We've said that Alolan Sandslash can work with the Telescope tool card. But there is actually a handful of other water types out there that could benefit from this. Like Dugong with triple accelerations could then lead into Barrascuda, so you could finish off Crobats or Dedenes and stuff like that, with that 60 becoming a 120. So there's actually a handful of dangerous numbers out here. So I wouldn't write off Barrascuda as a complete joke. And I wanted to give him that 2-star just for that sort of credibility, but he is still a stage 1. He's still quite niche, so I don't think he's going to be the star of the show at any point.
Next up, we have the Cramorant that Joe just mentioned. Cramorant has the continuous gulp attack. Discard as many Arrokuda from your bench as you like. It's attack does 60 damage for each Arrokuda discarded this way. So that's actually 240 for a twin energy, which is pretty good. Given that the Arrokuda also searches itself out, that's not bad. And in combination with Nessa, as we mentioned earlier on, Nessa can grab you those 4 Arrokudas back. So every turn you can be 200 for a twin and 240, sorry, for a twin energy, with the option to, like we said, keep a Barrascuda on the board or keep an Arrokuda on the board to evolve and snipe something next turn. To me, it has very Mad Party vibes, but a little bit worse because you're discarding your bench every turn. So all of a sudden, you can lose to, if you miss another Pokemon, you can either do less damage or lose to bench out, that kind of thing. So it's got very Mad Party vibes. This whole package set in one deck feels very exciting, and it will definitely be fun to try out. I don't think it will be meta breaking, and I don't think it will be any better than Mad Party. Mad Party hasn't seen too much play for a little while, but in general, I think it's going to be a fun one to build around and a fun one to try out, and it should be, like I say, a lot of fun to play as well. I like the concept of discarding or finding all of these fish and then discarding them all and throwing them all at your opponent and then nestering them all back and doing the same again. So yeah, I think the concept is really great. I love it, but I don't think it's going to be massively meta breaking. But it may be another very fun one prize deck to build around, and hopefully we'll see some play in those kind of formats, which is cool. And also, I think Arrokuda has the best art in the set, with the Cramorant coming to get it. So that gets my art appreciation as well.
Had to sneak him in. All right, we move on to Galarian, Darmanitan V, and V Max. We've been way harsher than the majority of the community here, and a lot of it is down to its horrific metal weakness. It's a really sad thing to say that this is like almost immediately writing it off, but with such a heavy attack cost on that max snowfall, it immediately takes sort of the mantle of just being a Frostmoth partner, because there's no other way that you can really power this guy up. So then you're immediately comparing it to the Laprases and the Inteleons out there, and thanks to that horrific weakness, Galarian Darmanitan just doesn't stand up. It's got 320 hit points. The max snowfall does 200 for 4, which is already like not that efficient, and you do 30 to each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. Yes, you can try and use those telescope goggles or whatever they are to do extra bench spread damage around the board, but it's similar to Lapras's damage for 4 attachments, and you just have a terrible, terrible weakness. The regular Darmanitan V as well doesn't have too much to write home about. You can paralyze on a coin flip, and you can do 190 and 30 to yourself, but yeah, these attacks really aren't good. Essentially, the Darmanitan VMAX is a souped-up version of Morpeko VMAX, where both your base output and your bench spread is slightly higher, but Morpeko really didn't make any dent in the format, and this weakness is so horrific that it really is a struggle to see this Darmanitan doing too much work. That said, the max snowfall could lead into that Sandslash once again, so it's another potential partner for a huge spread kind of archetype, but man, that sounds like a lot of work to get multiple stage 1s up and running with this many energies.
Next up, we have the next evolution. We have Vaporeon, which has an identical ability to the Flareon. If this Pokemon has a memory capsule attached to it, both players' fire Pokemon have no abilities. And the only ones we could think of were Ninetales and Heatran GX. Ninetales hasn't seen play in a long time, ever since Boss was released. I think pretty much universally, even the fire decks have decided that we'd just rather play boss because we don't have time to set up another stage 2 and we're already having to be clunky because there's a center scorch we're trying to build or anything like that. So Ninetales really isn't that relevant. And disrupting Heatran's Burning Road is actually pretty cool, but again, there's no specific deck we can think of where you want to dedicate maybe 6 slots to this Vaporeon line to stop a Heatran Burning Roading you. If that's the case, there's probably going to be some kind of attacker, some kind of water colorless energy attacker that can probably do 100 damage and knock out the Heatran. That's just going to be better suited than playing this Vaporeon line. So yeah, very similar to the Flareon, but actually even less uses, so even less likely to see play.
We move on to another stage 1. That's going to be Werelord. It's a 200 hit point water type. Has the nice water availability that says when you attach an energy from your hand to this Pokemon, heal all special conditions. It's a nice option to have there. And the Hydro Pump attack for 4 colorless does 10 and 40 more times the amount of water energy attached to this Pokemon. So again, immediately your mind jumps to Frostmoth. You're going to try and power this guy up. And you're doing reasonable 2 shots for 4 energy attachments. You do have buckets that can make it a lot easier to access those energy cards. We now have Nessa that can recycle, your Wailmers, your Wailords, and your water energies. So it's actually not that hard to maintain attackers. One of the biggest issues with Stage 1 style archetypes in the game is just that there'll be a point where you miss your next Wailmer, you miss your next attacker, or whatever else. And this Nessa combo, especially with the early game buckets and even training court and stuff, you probably won't be missing an attack too often, as long as you can get set up in the first place. That's kind of the biggest hurdle. I've seen so many times with Inteleon VMAX how difficult it can be just to get that turn 2 attack off. And not that you're like completely dead if you don't do that, but in an ADP world, you probably are quite dead if you don't get that set up early, just because of how quickly they can pounce on you and stuff like that. Type coverage is okay. Water's not the worst. Scalable damage as well. So if they don't deal with the Werelord for whatever reason, if they're gusting around you or just can't deal with the sort of 200 plus that you could have if you want to commit tools to this guy, for whatever reason, you could commit even more energies and do a huge chunk. So I think it's fun. I think it's experimental, but there's just better Frostmoth cards now. I think the Werelord V and I think Inteleon VMAX both outclass this card for the most part.
Definitely. Next up, we move on to the lightning types, and we kick things off with Ampharos V. Ampharos V is a 210 HP V Pokemon with 2 attacks. The first Dazzle Blast for lightning colorless does 50 and confuses the opponent's active, and then for 2 lightning and a colorless damage spark does 120 and 30 to each of your opponent's benched Pokemon that already have damage counters on them. So again, immediately we're going to be building around this spread damage archetype, if anything, and it's going to be a fairly interesting partner for Beetle. Being able to start with a World Beam and go into a damaging Spark means that you're going to be doing probably 40 damage to everything on the bench per turn, which is pretty cool. Add in a Telescope Scope and you're going to be doing 70 per turn to Vs and GXs, and that's close to 2-shotting things like Dedenne, but you are going to need a little bit of supplementary damage to do that, and I think that's where a lot of times Ampharos is going to fall down. 120 plus 30 spread, again, it really isn't anything overwhelming, even in combination with Telescope Scope and Orbital VMAX. You're not putting on enough pressure, especially for 3 energy, on a 210 HP Pokemon that's probably going to be getting knocked out fairly efficiently. Obviously, you have all of the benefit of the lightning typing. We have Speed Energy and Tapu Koko, and I think that alone will maybe lend itself to experimentation of some kind of Ampharos spread box deck where you're going to be running the Orbital VMAX. You even have access to Turfield and Flapple, so maybe you can just do a massive spread box and just have Ampharos as the one sole attacker. But unfortunately, again, Pikarom has still managed to fight its way through all of the losses of Lightning type, the Lightning type hit during rotation, but that's basically because it self-accelerates once it's got set up, and it's going to be really difficult to maintain Ampharos' turn after turn. And because of that, whilst there's going to be some pretty interesting experimentation with spread archetypes with this guy, I think it's going to be too difficult to sort of churn out Ampharos' turn after turn, especially when there are only V Pokemon, not V Maxes. It's probably going to be difficult to stream them when they're getting knocked out every turn, even with which means you're not going to have enough time to do all of the put on enough pressure on the benched Pokemon, even with all of this stuff like Orbeetle and the Telescope Scope.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Damage Spark with the new tool card, the Telescope, I think it's one of the most promising ones that we have as a basic. But it's just a sad state that is the most promising one that we have because it's pricey. We do have Turbo Patch as well, and we do have the new Electrode that we'll get onto momentarily. But yeah, still a lot of work. Here is the Electrode. I actually think this card is very solid. We've given it a 3-star rating. It's a stage 1, 90 hit point lightning type that has the Energy Generator ability. Once during a turn, you may knock this Pokemon out and search your deck for up to 2 lightning energy and attach them to your lightning Pokemon in any way that you like. Then shuffle your deck. I really like this option. It's a deck thinning type card whilst also being some nice acceleration for you. I think personally that Pikarom has mostly survived on the fact that it has Crushing Hammers and Reset Stamp available to it as an option. And this Electrode kind of does lean into that as well. It means that you're much more likely to get that full bits on turn 2. As long as you can get into Electrode, it means that you don't have to worry about doing Tapu Koko shenanigans. But I actually think more likely is that this is going to make the face of a new Lightning deck, which is going to shy away from full bits altogether and move more towards Raichu and Vikavolt V, where you're intentionally blowing up your Electrodes to accelerate your energy cards, and then you're trying to weave in earlier reset stamps in combination with Paralysis from Tandem Shock or with Item Lock from Paralyzing Bolt, and using those two in combination with one another to create a new Lightning style archetype. I do think that there's still a lot of inherent power behind Raichu's Lightning Ride GX attack. Again, with Stamp, you can really manipulate that prize trade effectively. So I think I'm really excited to try out the new Lightning deck. The only thing that concerns me is that obviously one of the only interesting cards in this set is a fighting Pokemon, the Colossal. So there's a small headache there that there could be more fighting stuff coming into the format, and Donphan as well, actually, I should say. So that's a small hurdle to deal with, but I do like this Electrode. His ability has a lot of synergy with the Lightning stuff that we currently have available.
For sure. I think I was going to say the other thing I think about Electrode is we've seen these kind of Miss Magius style decks work before, and I think that means, like you say, you can't just write this off. Especially as it also thins out dead draws from your deck as well. So you actually make your deck better by by using the ability as well. So whilst it's not drawing cards like Miss Magius did, the Electrode is making the cards you draw higher quality. So it's twofold. It's accelerating energy, which is great, but also making your deck thinner and therefore better as well, which is cool. Next up, we have the final of the evolutions. We have Jolteon, and as you would expect, Jolteon has the Thunderclap Awakening ability. That means when it's got a memory capsule attached, both players, water Pokemon, have no abilities. In this vein, we could only think of Frostmoth and Keldeo that are particularly disruptive. As I mentioned with the Decidueye, if you're struggling with Keldeo, in all honesty, there probably is some kind of Pokemon you can be playing to deal with Keldeo, especially as Keldeo does not account for V Pokemon. So there's actually a plethora of new attackers. There's 4 sets worth of attackers that you can use to get around Pure Heart. So there probably will be a more efficient way of dealing with Item Lock. It actually is pretty relevant against Frostmoth though, and there's not much a Frostmoth player could do. If Frostmoth ever gets crazy strong, oppressively strong, maybe Jolteon becomes good. I think this is probably the one that is most likely to see play, just because Frostmoth as an archetype could one day be so broken that Jolteon sort of keeps it in check. But I think even though this is the best one, even that is we're worlds away from that it's going to be very surprising to ever get to that point, regardless. So yeah, another pretty underwhelming, but I think probably the best of the 3 in terms of longevity, because Frostmoth is a card that can theoretically only get better and better as more water Pokemon are released.
We continue with more Stage 1 Lightning stuff. This is a Manectric that has the High Speed ability. Once during a turn when you play this card, from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may draw 3 cards. We've seen this previously on a Beware. That was in a format before Scoop Up Net though, and this does have free retreat, so there are some benefits to its predecessor, but ultimately you're not going to be playing a Stage 1 just to draw 3 cards periodically throughout the game. You're not going to commit the board space or the deck space, so it's too small of an effect to really run in the majority of archetypes.
Next up, we have Pikachu V and VMAX. sort of the front runners of the set, or the stars of the set. But unfortunately, we think they're both pretty underwhelming. Pikachu VMAX has 310 HP. Again, we've said pretty squishy, especially when you're also weak to fighting, which Eternatus right now is weak to fighting. So there's already a premium on being a fighting type Pokemon. This already sort of falls into the line of fire as well. Gmax Volt Tackle for 3 lightning energy, just 120, and you can discard all energy and do 270. For a VMAX attack, that's actually pretty underwhelming and fairly boring compared to some of the ones we've seen, which really sucks in terms of Pikachu's sort of playability. We don't think it's going to be particularly strong. Overall, having the flexibility of 120 or 270 is good. It would be way better if we could see one-shots, though, and unfortunately without E-Power, 270 falls short, especially when you have to pay 3 energy, then discard 3 energy, just to do the same amount of damage that Eternatus does for 2. So you can already see from a comparison standpoint that, in general, it doesn't sort of land particularly well. It doesn't fall on its feet next to some of these other VMAX Pokemon we have in the format, and there's not many reasons to play it. If you are going to, though, the Pikachu V has a really nice ability, or first attack charge, that lets you self-accelerate. Obviously, that's pretty scary, leaving your Pikachu stranded in the active, but at least you have a way of being a little bit more consistent, and things like Tapu Koko and the Electrode can mean that you can stream Gmax Volt Tackle every turn. So it's maybe somewhat playable that you can stream them, that kind of thing, but in general, it's not anything to write home about at all, really. It really falls short in comparison with some of the other VMAXs we have right now, and is also squishy, and also you have to give up prizes for your energy acceleration. There's really not too many sort of selling points. One of the biggest ones is just the variety of different lightning type Pokemon that you can play in a lightning type deck. Maybe it's not a Pikachu VMAX deck, maybe it's just sort of a lightning box deck where you're going to play a 1-1 or a 2-2 Pikachu VMAX just as something tankier than a Pikarom or a Choo-Choo in order to tank a hit and maybe Gmax Volt Tackle to close out the game. I think that's probably the most likely place we're going to see Pikachu see success. I don't think the pure Pikachu VMAX deck will be particularly good at all. But yeah, it's interesting nonetheless, and hope maybe it can see play in some kind of lightning box deck where this is your big tank that basically you stamp them to low, and if you're not going for some kind of item lock or paralysis, which I think in almost all circumstances are probably going to be better than just putting up something tanky in the active, maybe you just want to play this Pikachu regardless. As such, at least this is far more bulky than some of the other options we have.
Yeah, I only really gave it the 2-star rating because I know people will experiment with Pikachu because it's Pikachu, but there's a lot of lightning support out there, so I didn't want to completely write it off. 270 is a pretty poor number, though. It's actually not that great for you with such a heavy cost, so yeah, I actually think this is still probably worse than like the Toxtricities and stuff that we have access to that really isn't doing too much. Next up, we have the amazing rare Raikou. It's a 110 hit point basic lightning type that has the amazing shot attack for grass, lightning, metal. You do 120 to the active, as well as 120 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. This is a pretty dangerous attack, actually. I like the spread option that you're going for. You can quite easily deal with a lot of one-prize Pokemon with that bench damage hit. And you can set up a good number of V Pokemon and regular GX Pokemon as well. So spamming multiple Raikou would be really good, but how on earth are we going to spam multiple Raikou with this horrendous attack cost of Grass, Lightning, and Metal? Well, potentially Crazy Code Porygon Z is the answer. I'm expecting there to be a very, very low tier rogue, purely amazing rare based deck, which is using Porygon Z, where you play Auroras and a shed load of the new special Grass, Lightning, Metal, and the other energies that you need to play for the other amazing rares that we'll talk about, all in one deck, and Porygon is going to try and cherry pick the correct one for the situation, and you load up that guy and try and use multiple hits with the one prize Pokemon that you play like 2 copies of each. So yeah, that's going to be Mimi fun. I do think this is one that you kind of use in a lot of situations though, because you can finish off things that you've done on the previous attack. with your other amazing rares, whilst also setting up damage again for future attacks. So you can either try and set things up if it's like 2 V maxes or something like that, or you can try and take, cheeky one prize knockouts here and there with other stuff. I think the Porygon Z is probably the safest way to go, but there's other acceleration options like Turbo Patch and Trumbeak, but I think all of the amazing rares are too expensive in attack cost to make them work, so I think we're getting crazy with this approach.
For sure. I think it's actually the best attacking option out of all of them. And like you say, 240 for 3 energy on a basic Pokemon, one prize Pokemon is insanely efficient. It's just held back by the pretty awkward attack cost. But like you say, we're only like 1 or 2 Rainbow Energy style cards away from this actually being threatening. And I think if Rainbow Energy was in format, this actually would be a potent archetype potentially, because we'd have 8 strong energy or 8 rainbow based energy, and like I say, 120 is actually very threatening. So yeah, really interesting card, maybe one to keep an eye on, but right now is definitely held back by that crazy energy cost. Next up we have Zapdos. Zapdos is pretty interesting sniping Pokemon. Snipe Thunder for 2 lightning and a colorless does 160 to one of your opponent's V or Pokemon GX. Obviously very comparable to Spit Shot. Sorry, you also have to discard all the energy for Snipe Thunder, so it's identical to Spit Shot, but can only target Vs and Pokemon GX. Now, in all honesty, that's probably what you're going to be targeting anyway. This perfectly knocks out a Dedenne, and with the Telescope Scope, it perfectly knocks out a Crobat. So why would you not play this card over Cramorant? Well, first things first, Lightning decks in general have never played Cramorant. If they want to snipe, yes, it's 6 energy, but Pikarom already has sniping capabilities, so if they ever really, really wanted to snipe, Pikarom is one inbuilt way that Lightning decks have to go. But on top of that, still, having sniping damage is fairly niche when a lot of the time you're two-shotting things anyway. You're probably going to want to be finishing something off in the active that you full blitz to once. You very rarely full blitz into something to then sort of snipe thunder something on the bench to close out the game, because you probably want to be knocking out the thing you full blitz, because that's probably your opponent's attacker. So that's why, in general, Lightning decks have never really played Cramorant. And on top of that, I don't think Zapdos all of a sudden being a Lightning Pokemon or one prize Pokemon makes Cramorant any more desirable, because I think if we really wanted to play Cramorant, we would just play Cramorant, because it also has Beak Catch, which is a great setup attack. So it's very weird to say, like, Zapdos is almost always a strict upgrade on Cramorant's Spit Shot because it's a one prize attacker. But I still think we would probably play Cramorant because it has a little bit more flexibility and has Beak Catch, and Lightning decks don't play Cramorant anyway. So this card is very flashy and very, very, I think, strong, but it just falls into an archetype that doesn't need this snipe damage. A lot of the time, Pikaroms will even be looking to do things like Paralysis Stamp you rather than going for a snipe for game. So Pikarom definitely has to play on the defensive a lot more nowadays, and because of that, it can't be aggressive with these sniping attacks. If this had been out when Pikarom was in its heyday, this could have been a great aggressive sort of game, a way to close out the game very aggressively. But unfortunately, I don't think that's how Pikarom is built anymore. It's a very defensive deck. It has to play hammers, and it has to really attrition out the opponent, paralysis, stamps, item lock, all of these disruption techniques. It's no longer the full blitz on turn 1 into Tagwell on turn 2 game, because it just doesn't have the ability to do that anymore. And in that style of archetype, you don't generally look for sniping damage to close out games quickly. You have to attrition down your opponent and run them out of resources, constantly doing a 150 every turn. So yeah, Zapdos is a very, very good card, I think, but it just falls into a deck that it just doesn't need it and can't fit it.
We start with the Psychic types with Alakazam V. Man, I'm depressed by this card. I wait so long for an Alakazam card to come back, and this is what they give us. A 190 hit point Psychic type. Like, it's already just abysmal. Like, how is it 40 hit points lower than Zacian just immediately out the gate? Then it has Mind Spoon. You place 3 counters on your opponent's Pokemon, sure. And Mind Ruler is apparently the best attack he has to offer. You do 30 times the number of cards in your opponent's hand. I mean, when your opponent's in control of this for the most part, it's very, very easy for them to stay out of one hit KO range with their attackers? What sort of hand size do they need to have for you to do threatening damage on VMAXs or tag teams? I mean, even with the bad additions of Surprise Box, the Alchemy that we get from this set, which can force your opponent to draw cards, even with Reset stamping your opponent into higher hand sizes in the early turns, I mean, there's just no payoff here. There's no acceleration for the Alakazam either, so you'd have to play like turbo patches or something. And man, it's so depressing when Alakazam is like a fan favorite for so many people, and he's just been done dirty like yet again. This actually makes me so sad.
Next up, we have that Alcremie, and we basically just dropped it in here because, well, partly for the Alakazam, but also partly because it's got a pretty interesting ability. Sweet Share. When you evolve this Pokemon, when you play this card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may use the ability. Both players draw one card, so you can draw a card yourself, as well as forcing your opponent to draw a card. In really weird situations, in lock decks, Jesse James, Weezing style decks, you can actually force more resources out of your opponent to make them discard more cards with Jesse James Surrender Now combo. But obviously, I don't really need to say much more than that. You don't want to be committing spaces to an Alcremie to make your opponent draw cards. In a lot of situations, you actually prefer your opponent to have no cards, so you want them to be able to stamp them low. And whilst you are discarding more cards with Jesse James, if you're able to Sweet Share cards into their hand, a lot of the times it's going to be way more consistent just to not play this package of Alcremie and Scoop Up Nets and stuff to try and get extra value, and just make sure you're able to initiate your lock when you need to, because that's basically the crutch of the issue of control decks right now, is if they can't initiate their lock, they lose. And this Alcremie, whilst it does draw you a card, it's never really going to be a consistency piece in making that lock come to fruition. So yeah, a very interesting ability, but not one that's going to see much play at all. But there is niche uses in control decks, and maybe you can force wins 1 or 2 turns early via Sweet Share.
Yeah, there's one just interesting point is that I've seen some controlling archetypes now with Excadrill, because you shuffle in so many cards, you get 4 targets, that some lists are playing Judge's Whistle, so that you just like Finn. And now Scoop Up Net, which is a card you already want to play because of Giratina, and just as a switching option in the early turns to protect your guys, and for board space issues, now you can turn that into a pseudo draw card with Alcremie, whilst also synergizing with like speeding up, forcing your opponent to deck out kind of thing. So I did again have to have a little think, go back into the Control Mind Palace and see if it's ever going to see play. I think it needed like Ditto Prism Star to be in the format to be a reasonable consideration, because it's too many spaces in the end. But yeah, I again had to... It's always weird and analyzing these sorts of cards, because you have to think about them so differently in terms of like the tempo of the game and everything you know about normal prize races. You have to think about this being used like 6 times in a row for like a bunch of turns to like force your opponent to draw more cards to get them into Surrender Now range of Jesse James and all this nonsense that you'd never normally think of. But yeah, just a small point on Judge's Whistle and how this could be a different option that also forces your opponent to draw more quickly, to fall into Jesse James traps quicker without you having to go for Reset Stamp over and over again. So there actually are reasons for this card to be quite interesting for control, but it's just too many pieces. Next up, we go on to Baynet. It's a very interesting stage 1. I already mentioned it earlier when we were talking about coating Metal Energy. It has the Devo Curse ability. Once during a turn, when you play this card from your hand to evolve, you may de-evolve one of your opponent's benched evolved Pokemon and put the highest stage evolution card on it into your opponent's hand. So the idea really around this card, for the archetype that I'm mostly seeing it in, is with this Zacian style approach, where you're probably playing Fiones, and naturally high bosses orders count in this sort of deck. You can Brave Blade into VMAXs, and obviously they tank that hit, but on the following turn you can go for boss plays, bring something else up, Brave Blade into that, whilst also Devo cursing their VMAX that is just tanked to hit. Now, this is obviously vulnerable to a bunch of things, like mostly Malolana would be a horrific thing to come up against, or even if your opponent is just, able to get around in other ways, and the fact that it's delayed by a turn as well. When you're doing a traditional prize race, you want to immediately take those prize cards, and obviously you're not knocking out the VMAX itself, so you're only taking 2 prizes and not 3. So there are a handful of issues here, but it is an interesting way for a Zacian style approach to sort of stand on its own 2 feet without the ADP. Now, the biggest issue is that all this Bayonet nonsense doesn't actually help that ADP matchup at all. So that already makes me think that you're going to be worse than just regular ADP or Luke Metal, which is a bit of a headache. But it's another way to get creative against those VMAXs. I think the other niche thing you can have with a Bayonet is, again, all these spreading decks with the telescope scope. I keep putting Alolan Sandslash in these slides, and I don't know if we'll ever actually see him see play. But you could accelerate a win condition by Devo cursing up like the thing that they were attacking with, i.e. a big VMAX, and making sure that gets knocked out alongside Crobats or Dedenes that they've put down naturally throughout the game. So yeah, a couple niches. I think the Bayonetization deck is something I want to try out, but I do think it'll probably be a lower tier than the traditional ADP or the Luke Metal approaches.
For sure. Next up we have Dusknoir, and Dusknoir has another of these really strange abilities, Ghost Bleach. All special energies attached to any Pokemon play have no effect and just provide colorless energy. So no speed energy drawing cards, no twin energy doing or adding an extra energy, no Aurora energy, nothing like that. Pretty cool effect. And I think in general that like there will be again probably some highlight reel moments where your opponent will randomly pop out a Dusknoir and all of a sudden your whole turn crumbles because you don't have enough energy to attack anymore and they all provide colorless and you can't attack. So pretty interesting. But I think the Dusknoir again suffers from the fact that it's a stage 2. We have had effects like this before in Crystal Beach, and also we actually have a pretty interesting way of accelerating into the Dusknoir itself. We have Spirit-Born Evolution that lets you discard 3 cards from hand to search for Dusclops and evolve the Duskull immediately as of turn 1, so you can actually get this out on turn 2. But nonetheless, it's a stage 2 bench sitter that does nothing really. It doesn't really help your consistency or anything like that. So you already have to play this sort of thick stage 2 line, or not thick, but a non-insignificant stage 2 line. And because of the Spirit-Born Evolution, yes, you don't have to play the Candy and have the Candy combination, but you do still then have to play probably 2 Dusclops. So it's going to be 6 cards. And do you want to dedicate 6 cards to maybe disrupt your opponent in certain situations? It's not awful, but at the same time, there's no decks that completely rely on special energy right now. Basic energy are so good right now. Welder, whether it's via Welder, whether it's via Frostmoth, whether it's just by Viridian City, there's actually not a huge amount of special energy this will hit. So yeah, it's not worth the 6 card at least addition that you're going to have to commit to your deck because of the Dusknoir, or to play the Dusknoir. But the ability is very interesting, and I'm sure there will be great highlight reel moments where someone will forget what the Dusknoir does and go to attack, and all of a sudden they can't and they lose. So yeah, really cool ability.
Yeah, it's one of these things to bear in mind. The format right now isn't scared of it, but there could be a time where his niche is actually useful. We come to a Whimsicott now, and I'm actually quite excited by this card. It's a reincarnation of Tool Drop with the Flying Rush attack. For 1 Psychic, you do 10. You can discard as many tools attached to your Pokemon as you like, and this attack does 40 for each card you discarded in this way. It also has a free retreat cost, and it has a triple draw option as well to just draw 3 cards if you've got nothing else working for you. You're a Psychic type, which means you can open yourself up to the Horror Psychic Energy as well for some extra chip damage in bits here and there, which is reasonable. And that 40 multiplier is actually pretty dangerous when you start adding it all up. The U-turn board, probably being the most important tool that you can be playing here, means that you could be doing a base of 170 every single turn just by looping the 4 U-turn boards that you can have access to every single turn. And obviously you can have up to 6 tools in play at any one time, with 1 on the active and a full bench all tooled up and ready to go. So you're able to deal with regular Vs, which is nice, and you're easily 2-shotting VMAXs and tag teams, which is really cool. And when that's the case, Giant Bomb becomes a pretty threatening card for your opponent. So if you're doing 5 discards, your full bench of discard, and then leaving a Giant Bomb on the active, that's a big headache for a lot of archetypes. So I think that could be one of the tools that, again, makes it into this little boxy style deck. Lucky Egg as well, pretty important one because U-turn boards naturally go straight back to your hand. So if you're getting hit with Reset Stamps or Marnies, having Lucky Egg established on your active Whimsicott could be a really important deal. There is a Garbodor in this set that can reset a bunch of tools that have been discarded, but I actually think this is not something you want to play. I think whenever I've tried to build this Whimsicott style deck, I want to be pure Whimsicott with just regular Pokemon which can draw yourself cards, whether it's Minccino, Pidgeotto, or just like Jirachis and stuff. Obviously, the new Amazing Rare Jirachi works very well with U-Turn board. So all of those things seem to be better options, and I would just stick to the Whimsicott, hoping that the U-Turn board recycle is enough for you to be in the game. But I'm actually very impressed by its damage output. Now, obviously, it still has the big issue of getting a bunch of tools into play. We no longer have Adventure Bag, so you still need to draw a bunch. It's not just as easy as finding a Whimsicott and Energy and being ready to go. You need to fill your board entirely with basic Pokemon and then fill your board with tools as well. So there'll be things that get drawn in the wrong sequence, which is always a headache for you. But ultimately, I have a bit of a soft spot for this Whimsicott one prize deck, and I'm definitely going to give it a lot of attention.
Next up, we have Woobat, an interesting little basic Pokemon with the Unarmed Waves attack. For a Psychic Energy, this attack does 30 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. If you have any cards in hand, this attack does nothing. Obviously, that's a pretty big downside and a pretty big condition. But we have made Granbull work before, so we know that this attack cost is viable. It's definitely not one that's completely out of the blue, and not one that's completely unobtainable either. Obviously, Granbull did 160 to the active, and this does a spread instead. We've talked about spread a lot this video, and again, Telescope Scope is another very relevant card for this attack. Being able to do 60 to everything for 1 energy is crazy, or 60 to all V and GX Pokemon. It's pretty crazy. So yeah, it's actually a fun little sort of puzzle to play. Granbull, I never particularly got on with Granbull anyway, but I enjoyed the puzzle of trying to work out how to get the hand down to 0 cards. One difficult thing is the fact that we don't have Instruct Oranguru or Magcargo anymore, so you can't tutor out the exact way of being able to get that one last piece in order to discard the hand down to 0. And that, I think, will be very, very noticeable in terms of this archetype. You're going to have to find different ways of being able to thin the hand down and play thick accounts of them, simply because we can't just tutor them out with Magcargo anymore. But we do have things like Rose Tower, and maybe this is the home for that Beedrill that we saw earlier on. Obviously, that draws you cards, but if you have no cards in hand, that can be a nice way of drawing some more consistency, because you're going to need to still draw cards every turn to try and play down these Woobats, because they only have 60 HP. So yeah, a fun little puzzle, and honestly, probably a deck that is more fun than anything, but it will be a little challenge every turn to try and work out, based on the cards you've been given, how you can get this Unarmed Waves attack off. Unfortunately, the attack is not strong enough to be able to ever see particular relevance, at least right now, I don't think. But I think the concept is very fun, and it will be, like I say, a fun little puzzle trying to work out how to achieve this attack each turn based on what you draw.
We move on to another amazing rare. This time it's going to be Zacian. It's a 110 hit point psychic type. It has the Metal Arms attack for 1 colorless. You do 30, and you can attach a basic energy from your discard pile to this Pokemon. And it has the amazing Sword attack for a Grass, Psychic, and Metal this time. You do 150 base, but if your opponent has a VMAX in play, you do an additional 150 damage, so jumping all the way up to 300. Very decent chunk, still a little bit out of range of dealing with a VMAX if it's in the active position, which is a bit of a shame, actually. I think with such an awkward attack cost, I would have just gone the whole hog and say, you know what, hit 350 or something like that. Because, just like we said with the Raikou, you're going to have to try and do some random crazy code shenanigans, Trumbeak, Turbo Patch. Now, the Zacian and the Zamazenta both have metal arms, which can do little prods and accelerate as well. I actually forgot that when I was talking about Raikou, so potentially the basic energy build will actually come out on top as well, because Zacian Zama do have some additional acceleration, but they are self-accelerating and they're only low hit point Pokemon, so maybe it's not relevant anyway. But I've seen some people talk about this being like a random tech card in ADP, but ADP playing additional 2 other energy cards and this card is just way too much work for the payoff of getting through some VMAXs, but not even all of them, because you're still 10 shy on Eternatus, so then you also need to play
Zigzagoon and stuff. So yeah, or Vitality Band and have it at the right time. So yeah, I think it's only again for this random Pori box that people are going to try and experiment with and have fun with. Its typing is pretty weak as well. Nothing really has weakness to Psychic right now that's relevant in the game, outside of like Mewtwo, and even they can tech for that if they really want to. But yeah, it's part of this random toolbox that we're going to be trying out. And actually, Scoop Up Net and Zigzagoon actually make sense in this deck already because you're wanting to do the Raikou ping stuff. So it actually makes sense to try and double down on that and try and have options to one-shot VMAXs. So that's a small cute thing going on there, but yeah, still just kind of rogue and weird.
Next up, we move on to the fighting types, and we kick things off with, I think, a lot of people's favorite card from the set, Colossal VMAX. This big fighting VMAX Pokemon that's obviously gonna maybe even provide some headache for Eternatus. 330 HP is pretty monstrous, and Eruption Blast is in certain situations can actually one-shot an Eternatus VMAX for 1 energy, which is crazy. Eruption Blast is 40 for 1. You discard the top card of your deck. If it's an energy, you do 90 more, taking it up to 130, and then you even get to attach it to the Colossal VMAX. So that's pretty cool. Lots of benefits for discarding an energy. We've seen these attacks in the past. They've never been crazy relevant when we haven't had specific tutor, but Oranguru Primate Wisdom lets you very easily pop an energy back on top before you use Eruption Blast. So whilst we don't have any ways like Magcargo of tutoring to the top, we do have Oranguru. And Oranguru isn't a terrible draw engine to build your deck around, especially when you can use it in combination with things like Research and Marnie to save resources as well. In these VMAX decks, it can be good to save some of these resources. So it's actually not a terrible engine to be building around in the first place. And then you have great typing. Obviously, you're doing 130 if you hit an energy, but if you're behind on prizes and play a martial arts dojo, you're doing extra 40. As such, doing 170 times 2 is 340, which is the bingo number for knocking out an Eternatus VMAX. So that's pretty cool. I think you can't expect that to you can't expect it to do that too consistently. You do have to go down a prize, and typically Eternatus decks don't take little prod prizes. They go for all out 270, and if it's not taking a prize, they're probably just hitting your VMAX for a big amount of damage. So in a lot of cases, because they want to win the prize race, so in a lot of cases, if you're going to be down, if you're going to be behind against Eternatus, you're probably 3 prizes down rather than 1 prize down. So it's a big dream. It's a nice dream, but I don't think the Martial Arts Dojo is super consistent. But as such, I'd probably still play 1 or 2 copies anyway, just for those times where you're able to feed them an early prize, maybe an early Jirachi or anything, any random 1 prize you can feed them early to then be able to Eruption Blast and take out an Eternatus and really try and slow down their energy. The energy that they've got attached. It could be actually a fairly good archetype. I think it can struggle with a handful of other archetypes, but maybe being able to put up a fight against Eternatus will make it worth at least trying to experiment with enough to try and find more answers for these other archetypes. You also have Gmax Volcalith for if you're ever able to get 4 energy onto Colossal. Doing a flat 240 is going to be knocking out every V Pokemon, so you have that sort of guaranteed knockout every turn if you're able to build up 4 energy, but I think it's going to be rare that you can get to do that in general, which kind of sucks. Maybe you have to pair it with the stage 2 Colossal, but all of a sudden you're getting Rillaboom vibes, and that deck is inconsistent on its own end, and it has consistency tools that fighting doesn't have, so you really are going to have to lean into that Eruption Blast, and as such, 130 can be underwhelming against a couple of other Pokemon in the format, but nonetheless, 330 HP. We mentioned Stone Fighting Energy earlier on, being able to make this even tankier. That in combination with like a Big Charm or something can actually make this Pokemon pretty tough to deal with. And on top of that, you can have a fairly cool engine in the Oranguru engine, as well as being able to put up a fight against Eternatus. I think you can see why I've rated it a 3-star, and in general, the community agreed. It's just whether that 3-star rating can convert into a relevant archetype within the format in terms of being able to deal with other decks, or whether this is just forever going to be a counterpick for things like Eternatus and Pikarom whilst they're rife, because you should pretty much body those decks very, very efficiently. But if you do fall short in terms of other decks, it may never be the kind of archetype that can crack into tier 1.
Yeah, a couple other notes. I like a tanking deck that basically has no weakness, because grass is quite poor right now, I would say, for the most part. And even if you are worried about the new Beetle deck, you typically don't have too many energies attached to you. Like Eruption Blast is forcing energy on you, but you can also find ways to remove those energies as well if really need be. I like how low maintenance it is. Like, you can miss turn 1 attachment and still be in the game, which is not the case for a lot of VMAX decks, which is actually a cool thing. So you can draw quite badly and still be allowed to play the game, which is cool. Its typing is currently very relevant, and its tankiness is great. Like, if you're stacking stone fightings onto yourself, it's actually going to be an absolute mission to get through. So I can foresee it, again, cashing in on the Malolanas and all those other cards, the health buff cards if you really want to as well. It's buff paddingable if you really want to. So yeah, this guy is going to be chunky as anything, and I'm excited to play around with him more than just the like Eternatus matchup or whatever. I want to see how he functions against all these other decks where his output is mediocre, but then you're making everyone else seem mediocre because of your reductions and the amount of raw hit points that you'll have in general. It's going to feel similar to Luke Metal, I think, where you're making the game go to like 7-8 turns at times, and that's going to be interesting to see where that sort of tug of war takes us. We move on to Donphan. It's an interesting stage 1 fighting type. One prizer, has 150 base hit points, which is pretty solid, and it has the Earthquake attack for 1 fighting. You do 120, and you deal 20 to each of your benched Pokemon. This is actually an upside in the decks that we're expecting to play it in, because your Fampies naturally come with a Strike Back attack, which does 30 times the number of damage counters on itself. But also, you can try and combine this guy with Spiritombs that naturally look to build Spite and work towards big Anguish Cries. So this is potentially a new update of a Spiritomb-based archetype where you now gain some better typing, which means you have a way better time against Eternatus. And in general, this accelerates the game plan of having a bunch of tombs ready to rumble throughout the game, so that you just don't sort of break the chain of attacks, because obviously attacking with anything but the Spiritomb gives you more time to build Spite for your eventual Anguish Cries to do a lot of damage. But at the same time, Earthquake is helping you along even further. So yeah, this could be a great way to really make Spiritomb's damage threatening once again. Like, we've really missed having the Hustle Belt, and we've really missed having Rainbow Energies around, and it's really slowed down Spiritomb in general. It's just become a bit part player in Eternatus. But Donphan speeds up that process all over again with good type coverage to boast as well. So if you want to make it Eternatus focused, you can again choose to play things like the Dojo if need be. Or you could still play the Spike Muff stuff and try and lean into that Spiritomb with the Capes of Toughness as well. So there'll be a bit of experimentation with Donphan. I gave it that 3-star again, just really because typing is relevant, and I can foresee it being good enough for that reason alone, because again, it's a fairly chunky one prizer, which is a headache. If you want to go pure Donphan as well, that's absolutely available to you, because you have Stone Fighting, you have Dojo, and you have buff padding as well. So again, you can be a thick one prize Pokemon with 1 attachment, and the Fampies as well can benefit from that bench spread if need be. So yeah, a few different avenues for Donphan. I think he's pretty decent, to be honest.
Next up, we have Galarian Surfetched V. This is actually a Pokemon that's already out right now. You can get it in a box, but we wanted to mention it here because we'll probably be getting the full art version, and in general, we haven't chatted about this card too much. Anyway, so Galarian Surfetched V is very similar to Tapu Koko GX once during your turn. Has a Spear Closure ability once during your turn. When this Pokemon is on your bench and it becomes your active Pokemon, that should say, you may move any number of fighting energy from your Pokemon to this Pokemon. So basically, you can bust in, and you don't have to play it from your hand, but you can bust in, steal all the energy, and do full star for 200, trying to really capitalize on the fact that you're that fighting typing. You're able to deal with the all of the fighting weak stuff, things like the Eternatuses and the Pikaroms right now. The extra support from things like Stone Fighting can mean that you tank a little bit, and if you're able to tank a turn, You can then bust in Spear Closer with another Galarian Surf-Edged V and just basically ping between two. And then maybe you're able to do some healing shenanigans between turns or with the rest of your turn to try and make these Galarians a little bit tanky so that they can maybe try and take 2 knockouts each by switching to the bench and dodging out of the way. It's really good because it means if you switch to the bench, if you switch a damaged one to the bench, your opponent can't take out the damaged one as well as the energy, so they have to kind of prioritize whether they want the easy prizes or the energy, so it can create sort of like dilemmas for your opponent as well. Obviously, we have all that extra fighting stuff, things like Stone Fighting and Martial Arts Dojo that we've mentioned with all of these fighting Pokemon so far, along with things like Cape of Toughness and Turbo Patch that you can use with this Surf Edge to be able to try and accelerate some energy on. The deck is far too slow to be able to realistically play, or the format is far too fast to realistically play a Colossal engine, so you are probably going to have to lean into these Turbo Patches, but you only need to hit 1 on the first 2 turns of the game in order to be attacking going first on your second turn. And because the Turbo Patches can go anywhere, because you're able to Spear Closer all of the energy onto the Galarian Surf-Etched, it kind of doesn't matter. Even if you don't hit Galarian Surf-Etched straight away, you can Turbo Patch just onto your board and then sort of hoover up all that energy and go and take a knockout on turn 1 with full star. So yeah, really interesting. Unfortunately, I think the biggest thing about this is the fact that the only new card from this set that Galarian Surf-Etched gets is Stone Fighting Energy. Galarian Surf-Etched has been out for like a month or so now, and it has not seen any play. So we're reluctant to say anything will change because the only strictly new card it gets is Stone Fighting. There's a couple of Lightning cards or Lightning Pokemon that come out that maybe make Lightning decks a bit better, so maybe it gets an extra good matchup, that kind of thing. But Galarian Surf-Etched hasn't seen really much experimentation or play so far. But maybe when this new set comes out, when we're looking into some more of these fighting style decks, maybe this isn't a Galarian Surf-Etched deck at all. Maybe it's just a Pokemon in a fighting deck that can just hoover up energy from here, there, and everywhere that you've played throughout the game and close out the game with a random full star towards the end of the game for the last couple of prizes. So yeah, whilst there hasn't been too much play so far, we're still a little bit skeptical to say this is a 1-star card because the ability in combination with the typing, in combination with the fact that fighting actually gets some decent support this set in terms of other Pokemon and other decks, maybe that's enough for this to see some play, even though the card itself has been out for about a month.
Yeah, well, I think the most relevant thing is Stone Fighting plus Cape finally puts you out of range of Zacian smacking you post GX buff. So, I mean, that's the only reason why I'm giving it more than the 1-star. Yes, it's a late review, but I think when you're trying to tank and bounce between multiple, naturally the Stone Fighting is like a big buff for it. I still think there's a lot of hurdles. It's clunky, it's an awkward combination of cards. 200's not a good number into most regular V Pokemon, so as well there's that to contend with. So there's still hurdles for the card, but Stone Fighting is pretty much I'm basically seeing Surf-Etched for the first time now that Stone Fighting has been released, because there was no reason to even think about this card because it was too squishy before, and now there's finally like some selling point if you have this reduction working for you. Next up, we have another amazing rare. It's the Zamazenta. It feels like I keep getting fed the crazy code stuff. But yeah, it's going to be the same spiel here. Metal Arms is an option to do a little prod, and Zamazenta being a fighting type is actually quite relevant. It means that amazing shield doing 180 can get doubled into an Eternatus, which is pretty cool. It again has a horrific attack cost, lightning, fighting, metal, and this Pokemon takes no damage from the attacks of Pokemon VMAX during your opponent's next turn. That's pretty solid text. There's a lot of VMAXs out there right now. There's going to be like the Colossal deck. There's Eterna, there's Center Scorch. Now, some of them do have ways that can still get around the Zamazenta, but it still forces more out of the opponent, which is okay. And like I said, just that fighting type coverage alone makes it a reasonable card to include in here. So yeah, it's another piece of the puzzle for the amazing rare nonsense that I'm going to be experimenting with, pretty much.
Onto the Dark-type Pokemon, one of my favourite Pokemon of all time, Drapion V, has been, once again, it's like another Alakazam, where we get this Pokemon so few and far between. Whenever we do, it's just so underwhelming. Drapion V, its first attack just is 3 for 70. How uninspiring is that? The second attack 3 or dark and 3 colorless energy. Hazard Claw does 130, so 4 for 130. We've already said 4 for 200 is underwhelming, so 4 for 130 is just awful. You can discard 2 energy from Drapion in order to paralyze the opponent and poison them, sorry. But as you can see over on the right-hand side, Switch is still massively relevant in the format right now. There's certain formats where Switch doesn't really see that much play, but right now there's a lot of decks running 3 to 4 copies of Switch mandatorily. They don't change that count is locked in as much as 4 of their attacker is. So the paralysis is not particularly threatening, and on top of that, people have even seen Birdkeeper has even seen play. So the paralysis is really not exciting at all, especially as it's somewhat conditional as well, because you have to discard 2 energy. Obviously, we have ways of accelerating energy on the slide. Hydreigon and Porygon Z are both options, but they're both stage 2 options. So in a world where Eternatus can do 270 for 2 on turn 2 as a stage 1 Pokemon, we're never going to be playing a Drapion that has to play a stage 2 to do 130 for 4 and paralyze for very little effect. It sucks to say all this because, again, it feels like these V Pokemon should be far more inspiring than this. But this, the Alakazam, it's just really sad to see, but unfortunately they are. In terms of the V Pokemon, they're just going to be pack fillers this time.
We move on to Garbodor. I already sort of made my piece about it when talking about Whimsicott. I am a fan of the tool drop approach that we're getting in this set, but I don't think Garbodor actually fits the bill. Dust Cyclone requires 2 colorless energy, and you do 30 for each tool in your discard pile, then shuffle those tools from your discard pile into your deck. So it's only ever a late game option in the first place, so pretty useless for the early game, and it's already going to eat up like board space as well, and it doesn't have the synergy with Whimsicott's regular attachments of just Psych Energies, so you would have to also weave in Twin Energies, which isn't ideal. And yeah, it's like an option that protects you against Reset Stamp or Marnie, but you can do the same thing with Lucky Egg, and Lucky Egg is just inherently helping your damage flow throughout the entire game on any turn of the game. So because it can always just be discarded for damage. So I think Garbodor is a weak link in this deck. I think you just lean into those U-turn boards as much as possible to retain your damage output. And that's going to serve the Whimsicott approach way better than weaving in like a 2-2 Garb with 2 Twin Energies. It's just not going to work out for you. And committing any more space to this card is going to be even worse, because then you're trying to use this attack multiple times, and this shuffles a ton of tools back into your deck, which are all useless cards. Like, they don't, whenever you draw into them, they're not doing anything outside of being damage for you, but it doesn't help you get any further into the deck, and just makes you way worse off in the long run, I would say.
Next up, we have Aegislash V and VMAX, one of the last VMAXs we will talk about today. Aegislash is actually one of the better ones as well. I think this is really interesting, but I think the Aegislash is actually better than the Aegislash VMAX for the most part. The Aegislash V has 210 HP, and it has the Sonic Edge attack. That's going to be the main one we're going to be looking at. A 2 metal and a colorless. It does 130 damage, but it goes through all effects on the opponent's active Pokemon. So it's a wall breaker, and that's very relevant because typically ADP has basically had to run Duraludon as a wall breaker because it breaks walls specifically, but because it gets around a variety of different walling Pokemon that your opponent can play. Aegislash actually does it even better because it gets around the Obstagoon, which Duraludon doesn't get around, and is way more tanky and does more damage. So Aegislash is a strict upgrade to Duraludon in my eyes, in terms of being a counter to some of these awkward decks that ADP can come up against, things like Decidueye and Obstagoon. It does 160 damage after the Altered Creation buff, which knocks out the Obstagoons cleanly, which is really, really good. And in general, it's just a great Pokemon in order to, like I say, break walls, which is obviously fantastic. The VMAX is at least worth noting as well. Does 320, or has 320, sorry, HP, and Max Slash does 160 plus 30 for each 30 more for each prize you have taken. So it scales as you go, and given that your first Ultimate Ray is going to be taking 3 prizes more than likely, this is actually going to be doing 280 after the buff, which is technically more than Zacian. So yes, you do have to set up a VMAX, but it actually does more damage than Zacian after you've Ultimate Raid if you're taking 3 prizes. So may not be worth completely writing off the Aegislash. Obviously, Zacian has inbuilt Intrepid Sword and is only a basic, and has a lot of other benefits, but it's not worth writing off the Aegislash completely. But I think mainly you're just going to see the Aegislash V as a 1 count in not Eternatus decks, in ADP decks, to use that Sonic Edge in order to break walls and get through some of the more awkward things that the usual ADP lists could sometimes struggle against, especially if they weren't teching for it. I think now it's very easy to tech for it. Some people didn't want to play Duraludon because it wasn't a great card anyway, and they just didn't respect the archetypes. But now I think Aegislash is very, very potentially even staple in it, just because it's such an efficient attacker for those. There's no risky, if this Duraludon dies, I have no way of dealing with this archetype still. Well, the Aegislash is never going to get knocked out particularly quickly by these locking decks because they don't do enough damage. So Aegislash basically turns these locking decks into an auto win as long as you're able to get the Altered Creation off, because once you've Altered Creation, they're really not going to be able to deal with an Aegislash that can Sonic Edge for a knockout every turn. So yeah, very interesting card. The V, I think, surpasses the VMAX in terms of playability, but I think the VMAX is definitely worth keeping an eye on, just because maybe you want to try and slap it into the deck for whatever reason, if we need to be doing more than 260 for some reason. But typically you're going to be playing these VMAXs to get around things like Obstagoon and stuff, and Aegislash already does that. So yeah, really, really interesting card, and another tool in ADP's sort of toolkit.
Exactly what everyone wanted to see. We'll move on to Duraludon. It's a 1 prize Pokemon. We just said that Aegislash is going to take the place of previous Duraludon, so this one has to be better than the current Duraludon that we have, as well as this new Aegislash, and boy, it does not come close. I only wanted to mention this card because really it's another potential Pokemon for Donphan if type coverage becomes important, because Raging Claws does more damage the more damage counters it has on itself. So I was just thinking about having an option in here as a type coverage type card, so it's one to bear in mind for future, but not much else going on here at all, to be honest.
Next up we have Fortress. Fortress is a Stage 1 Metal-type Pokemon. It has Takedown for 120. It does 30 yourself, but we're mainly looking at the Tie Bomber attack for 2 Metal and 2 Colorless. Both active Pokemon are knocked out, so that's why it's a Tied Bomber, because both Pokemon are knocked out. Obviously, if you're trading 1 for 1, that's pretty bad, but if you're trading maybe a VMAX for this, you're getting a 2 prize sort of plus, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, this is not an efficient attacker at all. You have to attach a twin plus Saucer to it twice, realistically, in a turn to be able to surprise anyone with this Fortress. You can go into things like Doll or maybe a wall, something like an Altaria or something, to try and minimize the amount your opponent can do after they've been knocked out by the Fortress. But in general, we've seen plenty of these styles of cards before, and they've never been particularly great. I think there's been some fun highlight reel moments with Beedrill, but we all know that 4 energy is a very high price to pay, even if you are knocking out your opponent's active Pokemon for free, or for the cost of 1 prize. It's still too much sort of setup to be worth the cost, and because of that, whilst it's going to, again, probably a great highlight reel moment, but it's just not going to be efficient enough to actually be a relevant archetype, but definitely a fun and wacky attack.
We go on to a Galarian Berserker. It's another Stage 1, but this at least does have the good Evolution Raw Galarian Meowth at its disposal. It has the Invasive Claws attack, which is the main talking point here. For 1 metal, you flip 3 coins for each heads, look at your opponent's hand, and discard a trainer card you find there. It actually gave me some vibes of the Pawniard that was played in some controlling style archetypes, simply to pick away the switch outs from people so you could just beat them by trapping them. And that's kind of the idea here. Invasive Claws could be picking apart a bunch of trainers, stopping your opponent from having draw options, as well as taking away their switching outs. Ultimately is going to be the main deal here, so you can try and do Boss's Order trapping. You have Glimwood to improve your coin flips if need be, but you could just go for a Galamine as well with Boss's Orders and Absols. And the thing I like about the card is that the Meowth makes it quite easy for you to chain Berserkers if you're going to try and just continually do hand removal style stuff. But I think ultimately the Excadrill Infiniteness is a better win condition than picking things apart based on coin flips overall.
We move on to one of the last amazing rares. I think there's one more after this. This is Jirachi, though. Jirachi Amazing Rare has a pretty exciting ability, Dream Oracle. is what makes this the best amazing rare in the set, in our opinion. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active Pokemon, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one of them into your hand, and return the other one to the top of the deck. So you're getting at least one more draw every turn, but more than just draw a card, it's draw the better of the 2 top cards, which is really exciting. Is definitely going to help with consistency. We have things like U-turn board to be able to freely promote this as a pivot after a knockout, or even just switch into it at some point during the turn for an extra card. Obviously, things like Pidgeotto, Cincino, the current Jirachi, Stellarwish Jirachi, have all seen masses and masses of play over their tenure in Standard. And I think it's probably unlikely that we're not going to see some kind of similar effect from the Dream Oracle Jirachi. That being said, I think it is still a little bit weaker whilst we have a lot of these other options in format right now. But I think especially when we see Pidgeotto and Jirachi Stellarwish rotate, Dream Oracle will be very relevant and could be extremely splashable in a lot of different decks. Just being able to draw one extra card alone is pretty nice. We've seen a variety of different Pokemon just played to be able to draw an extra card, but the fact that this isn't just draw one card, this is looking at 2, is really nice. So you're able to dig deeper into your deck without really having to discard a lot of resources or anything like that. So yeah, it's just going to be a very nice way of being able to get a little bit of extra supplementary draw to your supporters, to your Cincinos, that kind of thing, which is great. Also has that the amazing start attack, one of these crazy attack costs for 3 different types of energy. Search your deck for up to 7 basic energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like. Then shuffle your deck. The attack is very flashy, but ultimately, looking at it, you're spending 3 energy, and it's not 3 energy that is easily accessible. It's probably 3 attachments, or at least some coin flips via Turbo Patch or something like that, in order to set up 7. So you're actually only gaining 4, and whilst gaining 4 free energy, arguably via Amazing Star, is obviously very good tempo. It's very good value. The tempo is not there. You don't really want to be attaching for 3 turns to a Jirachi when at any point the Jirachi could get knocked out. And in all honesty, it's probably a fairly high priority target for your opponent anyway, because it's also your consistency. So you're never really going to be leaning into the Amazing Star too much, especially until we see some kind of some way of being able to actually make any of these amazing rares particularly quick to set up. But the Dream Oracle ability is so good regardless. We feel it's still going to be a 4 out of 5 and could be a whole engine on its own. Just being able to flip between these U-turn boards and switches and scoop up nets, that kind of thing. Just being able to Dream Oracle multiple times per turn, like you can with Stellar Wish every now and again. The big thing about this, though, is you don't fall asleep, so you can still retreat afterwards. You're not forced to find a switching out. So yeah, very exciting card, and more consistency is always great for the game.
Yeah, I think this one's a lot more passive than Stellar Wish comparatively. I think these days it's like a heavy duty engine. You need to play like 4 Stellar Wish Jirachi plus a bunch of Switch plus Scoop Up Nets to make it work, or at least weave in Bird Keepers. Whereas this card's a lot more sort of relaxed. You can play like 2 copies of this card and just naturally have U-turn board synergy in your deck, and then like it's fine to just get a little bit of value here and there, sort of trickle value. I still think Stellar Wish, if you are like a digging early deck, is still probably a higher priority because it just sees so many more options. But I do like this, it's some small hand advantage. Information as well, you get to know where your top deck is. That could have synergy again with like the Colossal that we talked about, or a few other cards, or just info for the following turn as well. So yeah, there's some good stuff to like here. I just really like that you can play this card, and it's a little bit of stamp proofing whilst only being like 2 slots in your deck or something like that, if you're already playing cards where U-turn board or air balloon could be useful, so that's just a nice thing about it, which is very, very different from Stellar Wish now, which since Escape Board rotated, it became like a whole thing. Like you're deciding to commit 8 spaces to Jirachi or you're not. This one is very different in that regard. We then have a 1 prize Magina. I really just wanted to mention this card because it has a similar attack to Morwild's Wily Bite, the Automaton Cannon, I should say. Does 10 plus 20 times the number of your opponent's bench Pokemon. It does have an Overhaul attack as well, which can shuffle and draw 6. But yeah, this is not worth a space compared to Morwild because Captivating Wink provides so much disruption in like a general sense. So yeah, it's like comparable to a Morwild in an ADP style deck in terms of its attacking presence with Automaton.
but the Mawile is still going to be the better option, especially because Cherish Ball is accessible. So yeah, just a quick note on that.
Next up, we have Steelix V. Steelix V is another pretty underwhelming V Pokemon, unfortunately. 250 HP, though, is very relevant, and actually, in combination with things like Luca Metal in the Hero's Bath and Metal Goggles, it can be pretty difficult to get through multiple of these before you've run out of resources. If you are, the fact that you're having to do a lot of chip damage against this really helps with its first attack as well. Raging Hammer for 2 energy does 30 plus 10 more for each damage counter on this Steelix or on this Pokemon. So you actually have this outrage style attack that can really lean into the fact that you have massive HP and have a lot of resistance. So that's pretty cool. The second attack, Iron Tackle, does 2, 10 for 5 energy, and you do 30 to yourself. So not great, but again, in general, because you're reducing damage, the 30 seems a lot less sort of risky when you probably or potentially maybe out of 2-shot range anyway. So this is all nice stuff, but unfortunately, whenever we see a metal Pokemon, we immediately have to compare it to things like Zacian and even Zamazenta V now. And unfortunately, this is way too reactive. The Iron Hammer is way too reactive, along with the fact that the Iron Tackle is 5 energy, so it's not a reliable source of damage. These just pale in comparison to things like Zacian and Zamazenta, which have way more utility, have much cheaper attack costs, and have upsides of being able to either draw cards or wall very important Pokemon at the same time. So yeah, Steelix V is pretty tanky, but unfortunately, I think that's not what you really need in comparison to being able to just do a boatload of damage with Zacian or completely wall something with Zamazenta.
We move on to the colourless stuff at last, and we are starting with a Stage 2 Exploud, so you know where this is going. It has the round attack. It does 50 times the number of your Pokemon that have the round attack. It's a historically fun archetype that we've seen in many iterations. Exploud's the newest one that we have available. Yes, it has twin and triple acceleration available. The only other Pokemon that has round right now, to my knowledge, is Loudred. Loudred being a Stage 1 means that there's so many headaches here. It's so slow to get this Exploud working. You need to not prize any Loudreds to do good numbers. You need to continually find your next heap of Pokemon. Again, one of these Pokemon that you just have a sort of footnote in your mind that there's a Pokemon in the format that has round. If ever there's another set with Pokemon with round, maybe it makes it more relevant, because the 50 times multiplier is a lot of damage. But right now, we're just waiting in the wings for it.
Next up, we have Lugia, and Lugia has a crazy interesting attack. 250 for 4 with Wind Pressure is obviously a solid amount of damage. But if your opponent has 5 or less cards in their hand, the attack does nothing. So that's the condition, and that's how your opponent can play around it, trying to keep their hand size low in terms of stopping you from being able to Wind Pressure for 250, which is crazy. You can actually Wind Pressure on turn 1 with Welder plus Twin Energy. So going second turn 1, you can actually Wind Pressure for 250 on the first turn of the game, which is crazy. And you can even force your opponent up to 6 with Reset Stamp or things like Surprise Box on turn 1, and then Alcremie in the late game or later on in the game. So you actually can at least interact with your opponent's hand to try and keep them above 5, which is good. Unfortunately, because this has 130 HP, you are going to have to be weldering very, very often, because these things are going to be going down pretty quickly, which means you can't play things like Boss particularly effectively, or Research, or Marnie, or anything like that. So you're immediately at a disadvantage to a lot of the decks in the format. But interestingly, the biggest sort of, or one of the biggest ways you can actually play this, because you're playing Welders already, maybe this just becomes kind of like a Welder box style deck, where it's an attacker. We have a variety of different attackers that benefit off of Welder. We've seen things like Cramorant and Dubwool in Welder decks anyway. And obviously Heatran is a natural partner. So maybe that's the way you see Lugia see success. Wind Pressure is obviously crazy damage, 250 for 4, with realistically no real drawback, especially as on turn 1 you can kind of surprise your opponent with it, because you don't necessarily have to start it. The difficulty is your opponent having at least 6 cards in hand is actually a fairly difficult thing to lean into, because there's so many things that we want to be drawing and playing down at the moment. And also 6 is a real break-even number for things like Dedenne and Crobat, So basically, you're relying on your opponent dedenaing or crobatting and not seeing a playable card. And more often than not, that's not going to happen. So in general, the wind pressure text can be quite difficult to play around. We do have ways to get around it, but unfortunately, I think it's going to be its early game pressure is crazy, but its late game pressure I think is going to be, or its late game reliability is going to be too easy to play around, even from like turn 2 or 3. Your opponent's probably not going to have an issue playing around wind pressure, and you really don't want to be playing cards like Surprise Box in your deck. So yeah, it's fun and flashy, and I no doubt will see some kind of experimentation, because that kind of efficiency on a one prize basic Pokemon is definitely not something to ignore. But I think what will come to light is the fact that the late game for the deck is too easy for your opponent to play around during the mid to late game. That wind pressure kind of has to steal games, otherwise it's not good enough.
Yeah, for me, it feels like if ever it's got a home, it's like as a 1 or 2 count in a welder deck, and you just sort of like, you lead out Lugia, you get your value, and then you just say the rest of the toolbox will carry me throughout the rest of the game. But it still sounds like it's welder box with more steps, and I don't like more steps because you're only drawing 3 cards from welder, and you're already super reliant on Dedenne. And for anyone who knows, when you're playing a deck that has like 16 or 18 cards committed purely to energy, you're already like got some hurdles there with consistency. So yeah, just again, one of those age-old issues where it'll come off 1 in like 10 games, and then the other times you'll just be like, why have I chosen to make my deck way worse? Next up, we have the Rayquaza, amazing rare. It's a 120 hit point colorless basic that has the amazing burst attack for grass, lightning, fighting. You do 80, and you discard all basic energy from this Pokemon. This is 80 for each type of basic energy you discarded in this way. So it forces you to have 3 different energies anyway. So you do a decent amount of damage, 240 for the requisite. And it could be more if you have even more different colors of energies attached to yourself. This one has to be basic energies though, so you can't do the Porygon Z stuff. That's why you're not seeing it on this slide, where you did see it on all the others. So it has to be all based on doing Trumbeak stuff and Turbo Patch shenanigans, and that's really, really difficult to make work. Annoyingly, none of these amazing rares have good synergy with like Colossal or Rillaboom particularly. Like some of them have 1 color of those energies in their attack cost, but none of them can really take full advantage of those. So yeah, not many great ways to make this work. It's going to be a big one-time blow-up deal, and that's not super good when you're already jumping through so many hurdles to get it working. So that's nice. The collectors don't have to compete with the players for trying to get their hands on Rayquazas, because this is probably going to be a chase card for this set.
Next up, we have Snorlax, and Snorlax is a really interesting one. Has the Eat and Sleep ability once during your turn. When this is your active Pokemon, you may draw cards until you have 7 cards in hand. Using this ability ends your turn. So basically, it's Tropical Beach on an ability. If you're in the active, it's not particularly hard to get into the active at the moment. As I've said, Switch as a 4 count is very standard in like 60% of decks right now. So, you know, it's not going to be difficult to find Snorlax in the active on turns where you don't want to attack. Unfortunately, because you're only drawing up to 7 cards, sometimes you're going to be drawing 7, which is fantastic, but sometimes you're going to be drawing 1 or 2. And in comparison with things like Zacian, I think it's actually very underwhelming. And I think this card, it has been vastly overhyped in terms of, oh, it's Tropical Beach and Tropical Beach is busted. Well, Tropical Beach is very, very strong and expanded, but it's a stadium, and it's far more accessible, not in terms of being able to get the card, but being able to search it and get it into the active, and search it and get it into play, and not have to give up a prize a lot of the time, because this Snorlax probably isn't living longer than a turn, and that kind of thing. So whilst this is Tropical Beach's text, and Tropical Beach is a very good card, it's very different when it's on a Pokemon in comparison to a stadium. And I think in a format where we have Zacian, there's a couple of decks, less so nowadays, but there are still a couple of decks that play Zacian just as a way to not end your turn by passing, end your turn by accruing some resources. And typically, I don't think you're going to get that much more value from Snorlax than you are from Zacian. And Zacian can sit on your bench, and you don't have to get it into the active, that kind of thing. Zacian does give up 2 prizes, but I think the utility of Zacian is a lot of the time going to be more useful than Snorlax. We also have things like Jirachi, both of the Jirachis that can be accruing resources in your hand and building your hand size. And because of that, maybe you already have 7 cards in hand ready, and Eat and Sleep would do nothing, whereas Zacian always draws you 3 cards. So I think the breakpoint of the card is probably less than 3 cards, maybe a little bit more, but I think Zacian is more reliable and probably will net you more cards overall throughout the course of the game than the Snorlax will. Interestingly, Snorlax is almost certainly better stamp proofing than Zacian towards the end of the game, but obviously, in terms of that, you need to have the Snorlax on board already, because it's usually going to be paired with a knockout, so you can't even find the Snorlax that turn. You have to have the Snorlax on board already, and then you have to find a switch out as well in terms of trying to stamp proof yourself. So yes, you may be drawing more cards, but you also then need to find an extra card to be able to move the Snorlax to win the game next turn. So yeah, they're very comparable, and obviously Tropical Beach is a fantastic card, but I think it's very different in terms of when it's on a stadium as to when it's on a Pokemon. And whilst Zacian is in format, I think overall you'll see that the breakpoint of cards drawn via Eat and Sleep is probably very rarely more than Zacian on a large scale. When looking at it on a large scale, there'll be random situations where you're like, oh damn, I'm drawing 7 cards here with Eat and Sleep, this is crazy. But there'll also be situations where you're like, oh well, I have 8 cards in hand, I guess I'll pass, and you'll really wish it was a Zacian instead.
Yeah, I think just straight out the gate, we have so many proactive draw options. Jirachi, well, both of them, they give you access to cards immediately that you can use, and straight away, I would always choose those over retroactive draw from Snorlax and Zacian, which you can't access until the next turn. If you're looking at control, we know that Zacian has been played a bunch in controlling archetypes, and I still think that will be the case, although control is usually trying to deny your opponent from taking prize cards. Just the fact that Zacian is searchable and you don't have to get it into the active already makes it super important, because well, especially right now, Drillbur has a 2 retreat cost, so you can't even like attach and retreat into Snorlax on your opening. So Zacian is immediately way more usable than Snorlax, and it's a deck that's trying to accumulate value and not just top your hand back up after you've played a bunch of cards. That's not how control works. So it's not going to be the new face of control. Possibly it's a one-of alongside 2 copies of Zacian. So there are those situations where you're up against potentially fire archetypes or something like that, where you're very hesitant to put down Zacians because they're so easily picked off and just taken out for multiple prize knockouts. So I think there's a glimmer of hope of it being like a one-of card in that sort of archetype, but I don't think it ever outweighs Zacian. And like you said, Jack, Tropical Beach was in a time where you could easily like Skylar for it or something like that and put it into play and get a bunch of cards all at once. You had more time to set up. Most of the time, Tropical Beach was going into rare candy-based decks where all you had to do was find your basic, then beach, and then you're ready to candy to stage 2. That's not what Snorlax is here for. I mean, maybe you can try and play him in candy-based decks if you really want to, but I would still say that Stellar Wish is probably going to be a better bet, because that gets you turn 1 ball search cards in the first place, and it gets you that rare candy on 2 as well if it happens to survive. So yeah, I think Snorlax is just kind of beaten out by the other options that we have so many of in the format right now. It's really fun that we saw a full wheel from the community here. Some people are saying this card is going to be insane in everything, and some people are saying it's kind of lower down that tier list. A lot of people going down the middle as well. We think there'll certainly be people experimenting with it, but I'm so against retroactive draw, and I am so concerned about how few turns you have in a game of Pokemon these days that we ever have time to really milk the value of the Snorlax too much, and that makes me think it's going to be outweighed by the other options right now, especially because it's very similar to Stellar Wish in that it has a 3 retreat cost, so you need to have a really high scoop up net and switch count to actually make him work, because you can't just slap an air balloon on him either. We move on to Togekiss V and V Max, a really interesting one from this set actually. It's a 310 hit point VMAX, again on that lower end, which is a shame. It does also have an awkward lightning weakness. These were a few things keeping it at that lower rating just straight out the gate. It does have a handy fighting resist now in the format, and it does have free retreat, so a couple good points going for it as well. Its attack is Max Glide. For 2 colorless, you do 120 damage. You search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. 120 is a really low baseline of damage, even with access to powerful colorless. Yeah, not looking too hot. You're looking to like 3-shot VMAXs and 2-shot regular Vs. That's going to be pretty slow, but the text on that attack is crazy. I'm sure a lot of you are already getting vibes of Breakzard. That's currently seeing play in the format once again, just recently. And also some Sylveon players out there may be rejoicing as they can start putting things immediately from the deck straight back into their hand. But this time Togekiss gives you a bit of pressure at the same time. So maybe people are thinking this is outrageous that they're able to deal damage as well as get value the entire time. I think straight out of the gate, that means that Togekiss is probably leaning towards one or two things. It's trying to offset the low damage output that it's doing in the first place by healing. And I think the main way you can do that is by trying to get Corviknights into play and try and like rare candy and scoop up net the Corviknights, which then heals off your Togekiss as long as you can tank hits, which is kind of okay if you have a big charmed Togekiss. You are kind of chunky as long as you're not facing lightning stuff. Or the other option is that you let your opponent knock out a VMAX and you do the classic stuff where you've accumulated the handlock pieces, Surge, Stamp, Jesse James, and then you're just going to use your second VMAX to make life very difficult for them as you continue to pressurize them and they have no hand to work off of at all. So you kind of slow grind them out with a handful of chips and then a few other annoying cards here and there as well. The regular V doesn't have too much to note. 200 base hit points is okay. White Wind does 90 to an evolved Pokemon, which is again just like reasonable for one attachment for early pressure if need be. Speed Wing, not impressing too much. But I know that will always be people wanting to build around this. Cherry picking cards from your deck is historically like very, very strong. There's a few limiting factors like the weakness, but outside of that, it can be worked into, and I'm sure people are going to have other ideas than the ones that I presented today, but like I feel like its raw damage output will keep it kind of low in the tier list, but there'll certainly be people who believe that this is going to be strong enough to work into the meta.
Next up, we have Trumbeak, and you will have seen it a couple of times on some of our slides. Trumbeak is a Stage 1 Pokemon with the Assault Trumpet ability. Once during your turn, when you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose any number of basic energy you find there, and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like. So basically, this is like a mini Max Elixir when you evolve into Trumbeak. Half the amount of cards, but you can hit multiple energy, and you can attach them to actives. They don't have to be basics, and or basic Pokemon, anything like that. So pretty interesting. Universal Energy Acceleration is always sort of great to see, and I think it's at least going to be nice in terms of being able to try different archetypes with the Trumbeak engine to see whether it's the way to play the deck. I think in general, though, there won't be many Trumbeak engines that see play and don't see play. I think the Trumbeak engine as an engine will live together and die together no matter what and no matter how it goes. I don't think there's going to be many decks that... If Trumbeak is good, I expect a lot of decks to play the Trumbeak engine. If Trumbeak is bad, I expect no decks to play the Trumbeak engine, if that makes sense. I think they will all live or die together. But Universal Energy Acceleration is great. We have Turbo Patch already, but maybe we even play these cards together to try and get a boatload of energy out instead of having to run things like Stage 2s, like Colossal or Rillaboom. Maybe you're just going to run Trumbeaks and Turbo Patches instead. If you don't want to go down the Turbo Patch route, obviously you want to be reusing this. Things like Scoop Up Net is pretty important to be able to replay the Trumbeaks. We have Rotom Phone to be able to tutor an energy to the top from the top 5, as well as Oranguru just to be able to straight up tutor one from your hand into the top. So it's difficult to work out exactly how many energy you need to be hitting for this Trumbeak to be value. In all honesty, hitting 1 energy is pretty good, but hitting 2 energy is a massive tempo boost in terms of board state, which is great. Obviously, you have to invest into this engine. You have to be playing some of these stranger cards, things like Rotom Phone. Oranguru is not seeing much play right now, so maybe you have to lean into these Oranguru engines again. And again, you have to play a Stage 1 line and probably a fairly thick Stage 1 line if you want to find it consistently. But we do have things like Com and Evo Incense in format anyway, so it's not the end of the world. It's not the most inconsistent. We haven't put any Pokemon specifically on here because, in all honesty, Trumbeak can go with almost every Pokemon in the format. It's Universal Energy Acceleration, which is just fantastic. I think in general, me and Joe both think overall it's going to fall on its face a little bit. It's not going to be overly impressive, but it's so universal that it's going to be very exciting to try all of these different engines out with the Trumbeak involved to try and accelerate some of these attackers out that maybe would have struggled beforehand. We've been saying today how some of these VMAX decks really struggle if they don't hit their turn 1 energy attachment. Well, this could be a way to maybe not immediately just lose if you miss your turn 1 energy attachment, that kind of thing. So I'm not certain it's going to be crazy good, but like I say, I'm pretty sure, or I'm fairly sure in a lot of cases, Trumbeak engines will all, like I say, live together or die together. But it will be very exciting to see whether the Trumbeak engine does become the mainstay in certain archetypes, and I think it's going to be a fun one to try out in almost every deck, just because universal energy acceleration is always just very good for the game.
Yeah, one for the wacky professors for sure. And that's going to round off the set review, guys. You can see the comparison between our ratings and the communities. I think one thing that obviously stands out is that no 5 stars were given by either us or the community. This is overall not going to be the strongest set that we've seen in recent months. We were pretty much in unison with what we gave the 4 stars. You can see the Jirachi, Aegislash, and Coating Metal all got the 4-star treatment from us. The community as well were bigger believers of the Telescope tool card as well. We were slightly more harsh, more happy to give 1 stars than the community, and that's always fine. We always try and be quite stubborn and stern on these reviews. We try and sort of shepherd you guys away from some cards that we think are more believer-based, and we are, at the end of the day, only focused on, the top-tier archetypes, and in our eyes, sometimes we're too dismissive, but that's just sort of how we are. But there we go. That's the overall ratings, pretty much in unison for the most part, although we are slightly more harsh in general. And that leads us into the trainers, tools, supporters, and stadium totals. Pause now if you want to get the lowdown or you want to screenshot it to your friend, because this has been a long review. Unfortunately, when you're talking about cards that aren't quite good enough, it actually takes longer, more often than not, than the ones that are obviously epic. So yeah, here's your chance to take a look at the non-Pokemon. And there's also the Pokemon here as well for you. Split them into types if need be. The real high ratings ready for Pokemon was Jirachi, which could go into a handful of things, and Aegislash, and then a few interesting VMAXs and stuff, but for the most part, more experimental, more things that could, be fun around the lower tiers and need a little bit more support to be pushed in the future.
And that's it. We've rounded out Vivid Voltage. As you can see, we have some pretty exciting pre-release promos coming, so make sure you can try and pick up a couple of pre-release boxes if you can from your local game store. Try and support them through this troublesome time. We want to be able to play Pokemon soon, so keeping them afloat is always good. And you can see you can get some fantastic promos. I think I'd be happy with a lot of these, to be honest. All 4 of these cards are cards that are either going to be collectible or playable, which is exciting. It's really good that we're seeing more and more of these promos be actually important cards. So I love seeing that. Snorlax, Charizard, Lugia, and Donphan, all fan favorites as well. So like I say, make sure you can head down to your local game stores and try and pick up a kit or 2. Helps them in this perilous time, as well as gets you some cards early and gets you some pretty exciting ones as well. The whole of the Pokemon scene is crazy right now, so you may even make a little bit of money at the same time. But yeah, other than that, we're really excited about the upcoming set, and we hope you are too. Hope you've enjoyed this review, and kicking off this review means that it won't be too long until you start seeing some deck analysis, some streams of Vivid Voltage content as well as the Omnipoke League rotating into Vivid Voltage very soon as well. So lots of exciting stuff on the horizon. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you're letting us what you think we got right and wrong down in the comments. We always love to hear your feedback, where you think we rated things too highly, rated things too lowly, rated things too low, and maybe some intricacies and interactions we missed. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video.